we go. Thank you. Okay. All right. Now, let me see if I can get back to where I need to be to share my screen because I don't think okay, there we go. All right, I am going, now the next step is sharing the screen so that you can see this. All right, let's start with there. All right, now. Okay, I think did it backwards, so let me change this a minute. All right. A second. One minute. See, tech stuff. What can I say? That's what we want to do. All right. Now then. All right. And you all, Susan, tell me if you're seeing the screen that I need you to be seeing. Nope. Okay, let's try this then. There we go. That is the screen that I want you to see.
And okay, I was going to say, there you go.
There we go.
Very good.
That's the one we want. Yep. Okay. So you're not seeing my notes page screen. You are seeing the copyright information, correct? And the welcome screen. Yes, somebody put their thumb up so I know we're doing this.
Yes.
All right, awesome. Okay, great, wonderful. All right. Let me just say before we start, I know that everybody comes to this with a different background, expectations, desires. So whether you are coming as a hostage because somebody is making you, or whether you're a cynic who doesn't believe in trainings at all and thinks they are a waste of time, whether you are a tourist who thought this sounded interesting and thought you might pop in. 4 hours is a little long for a tourist, but okay. Maybe you're an explorer who wants to know more about this and has heard about it and thinks that it's going to be worth your time. That's great. Whether you are a survivor, and trust me when I tell you that I know there are survivors in this training. There are survivors in every training I ever do. Their experiences are critical to framing the work that we're going to do today. And you may hear some stories from survivors who are willing to share. But even if you don't, you should know that there are survivors among us and that they are still engaged in the work of the church is really due to the grace of God. So we honor any of you who are survivors, and we thank you for being willing to be here and to still share your gifts with the church. Everybody's welcome here. We will do the best we can to get you the best information that you can get and to answer all of your questions. I likely will not be able to answer all of your questions, but we'll do the best we can. And if you have questions that I can't answer, then I will see if I can find somebody who can. I'm going to ask you all as we're going through this to please mute yourselves unless you have a question. And again, I'm happy for you to jump in, but it is real helpful in terms of feedback and managing background stuff if you would put your microphones on mute, please. As we start, Joy, would you be willing to read the psalm on the screen?
Yes, ma'am. Psalm 119, verses 10 to 16. With my whole heart I seek you. Do not let me stray from your commandments. I treasure your word in my heart, so that I may not sin against you. Blessed are you, O Lord. Teach me your statutes. With my lips I declare all the ordinances of your mouth. I delight in the way of your decrees as much as in all riches. I will meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes. I will not forget your word.
Thank you, Joy. You know, God gives us boundaries as a gift. Sometimes we understand those in terms of the law. Sometimes we understand those in terms of the Great Commandment. Sometimes we understand those in terms of the Golden Rule. But the reality is that God shares with us and has in the scriptures primarily, but in other ways as well, things to help us order our life together. Boundaries are not just, though, about the commandments, but they're about our right relationship with God. They're about righteousness. They're about how we relate to God, and they're about how we relate to God's children, particularly those children whom God has placed in our care and who the church entrusts to us. So when we talk about boundaries, they're not really rules. They are about helpful tools to help us understand the work that we have to do. As we begin, will you all pray with me, please? Gracious and loving God, help us understand the parameters, the boundaries, the limits to our work. Help us understand that those are a gift from you, that we can glory in them, that we can rest in them, and that we can talk about and wrestle with them. Help us to do all of those things today. We ask in the name of Jesus, your Son, our greatest gift. Amen. Okay. You've heard me say boundaries are a gift. You have also heard me say we're keeping our fingers crossed about the technology. So here is our first foray into seeing if I can make this technology work. These videos are, again, put together by the Faith Trust Institute, and I think sometimes are helpful in terms of framing our conversation.
I think boundaries are a gift. I think that boundaries are the things that give shape to our relationships, all of our relationships.
And it's not showing the picture,
boundaries,
the video itself.
All right. It's not showing the video.
No, just the audio.
All right. Not quite sure what to do about that. What are you seeing on your screen now?
Hey, Ann, you need
Yes?
to share your screen, or I guess you're sharing your screen.
I am sharing my
Yeah, it
screen.
worked earlier. It's
It
just
did.
showing your screen, I mean, your
title
page.
My title page. All right. Let's see what happens if we do. Oh, that doesn't work.
Earlier, I can vouch
It
for
did.
that.
It did. We had it. We had it. All right. Let me go back here. I want you to see the whole thing. We'll figure it out. All right. I'm going to stop sharing and then I'll try resharing. Okay. And then we'll see if that works. Sometimes it does. My mother would say you just have to hold your mouth right. All right. Let's try that. Okay. Now. Okay. So you should be seeing the video screen. Yes. Yep. All right. Let's try this. We may not be able to do full screen, but you'll get the point.
I think boundaries are a gift. I think that boundaries are the things that give shape to our relationships, all of our relationships. And there are different boundaries that are appropriate in different kinds of relationships.
Now, one of the difficulties in ministry is that we misunderstand boundary setting with not being nice. A lot of people believe that boundary setting is a root experience. Through my filters, I believe that boundary settings is an act of grace.
Boundaries make it safe. In relationships, they let me know who I am versus who you are and how to keep being me without merging into you. So that boundaries became a very healthy thing And they kept me from getting overwhelmed by other people's stories as well.
We are in people's homes.
Okay. Excellent. There we go. Let's go. Okay. So what you heard in the video, I'm hopeful that you heard it, is that boundaries are a gift, right? They help us maintain clear professional relationships. This can be really especially important for, I think, our CLPs who may be serving a church where they have been members, right? Or where they still are members. So their relationship to the congregation may have changed. If you have worshiped as a member or been a member of a congregation, and all of a sudden you move into a role where you are the leader of that congregation, it's really important to think about the boundaries in some different kinds of ways. Boundaries are guidelines to help us know when and when not to participate in a given activity. I wish that there was a list I could give you of appropriate boundaries. There is not, because the guidelines and nobody really has those. I mean, we'll talk about some absolutely not under any circumstances boundaries, but the reality is that a lot of our boundary conversations, it really depends on context and judgment. So part of what we are doing today is helping you all think through the context and judgment, and so that you will feel like that you are better equipped to wrestle with those things. Boundaries really help us keep perspective when people's problems seem overwhelming. Having worked with, for years, people who were in a counseling relationship but were not in fact therapists. The people I supervised in my work were counselors. They were in some ways peer counselors, but they were not trained therapists by and large. But one of the things that was really important for them, as it is for clergy who, again, are often not trained therapists, is to know how to manage when other people's problems, when you are listening to and talking to people who are in crisis, how to be really clear and that their problems don't become your problem and that your issues don't become enmeshed in their issues. So boundaries help us keep that perspective. As part of that, they signal to others that it is safe to trust us. When we're clear about what our boundaries are, it really allows people to be vulnerable to us in ways because they don't have to worry that they don't have to keep up their guard because we are a safe space. And that's what we want to do. We want to be that safe space. And boundaries also protect congregants from an abuse of power, which sadly can sometimes happen in the clergy relationship. Boundaries are not clear rules about when and where we can be friendly or who we can be friends with. They are not blocks to authenticity or friendliness. Sometimes we think, okay, well, I just need to cut off all relationship and only interact in certain kinds of ways. And that's not really healthy boundaries. That's not what we want folks to do. All right, here we are. We have a second opportunity to see if the tech works. I'm going to try it again. So let's talk a little bit about how do we keep from violating boundaries inappropriately. Are we seeing this? Thumbs up?
We are in people's homes,
Okay.
and therapists, spiritual directors, doctors, and attorneys are rarely in people's homes, praying with them, sitting with them, maybe having coffee with them. That's a level of trust and acceptance that a therapist would very unlikely have with somebody. Because of that, I think it's harder to see the boundaries.
The fundamental question we have to ask ourselves at whatever point that we may be relaxing boundaries or wanting to relax boundaries in a particular setting is, am I doing this at the expense of the congregant? Is it in their interest that we do this? And what about the impact on the congregation and on the mission that we share.
The concept of
Mm,
power
so-
is not a negative.
We're coming to that in a moment. So when we think about how do we keep from violating boundaries inappropriately, these are some really basic guidelines. The first thing is we need to be aware of our own needs, and we need to find healthy ways of having them met other than by the people we're supposed to be serving. Now, we're going to talk more about this as we go through the training, but the bottom line is that part of what happens when people are tempted to violate boundaries is that those, whether they're spiritual leaders or clergy or whoever, they are living out of their own needs, and those needs are not being met in healthy ways. And so they are looking for other ways to get those needs met. So if we are aware of our needs, and if we can find healthy ways of having them met, other than through the people we're serving, that's going to help us maintain clear boundaries. One of my colleagues years ago, as we were doing training for the people who were going to be working in the rape crisis and domestic violence program, said to me, the question that you always need to ask is, whose needs are being met, right? Is it my needs as the counselor, or is it the client's needs? We have to ask ourselves all the time, is my behavior in the best interest of the other person, or is it only about me and what I need? And here's a good question, would I be comfortable if others knew I was doing this, right? If it doesn't pass the I could tell my mother about this test, then chances are it's a problem. Secrecy lends itself to the violation of boundaries. So if we are not comfortable, if others knew that we are behaving in a certain way, chances are it's a problem. Part of the ways that we keep from violating boundaries inappropriately, again, is to establish the system of accountability. Who in your life can you talk to if it feels like things may be slipping, or if you're having feelings that you don't understand or that you're finding concerning? Who can you go to? Is it the GP? The general presbyter? Is it another colleague? Is it someone, and that may be a Presbyterian colleague, that may be somebody in another denomination, but it's important that we have a system of accountability, that we have people that we can be vulnerable with, who can help us sort our way through some of those feelings that are not always easy. Now, to do all of these requires both the willingness to be vulnerable to the people that I need to hold me accountable. But they also require a pretty healthy sense of self-awareness, right? So those two things are really key. And we have to understand that boundaries are not always easy to discern, and there are often no clear guidelines for the best action to take. Remember, I said boundaries and managing those often depend on the context, and they often depend on our judgment. And so you may find a situation where or find yourself in a situation where, and you say, well, what should I do? And the answer to that question is, well, it depends. And we're going to do some case studies and some reflection this morning that will help you sort of suss out what are the kinds of questions that you want to ask so that you can answer that question. It depends on what. Okay. To do this, part of what we have to think about and look at is the issue of power. Power is an odd concept in this context, except it's not, because power really is at the heart of the matter. And we're going to talk about why that is and what that means. If I were to ask you, raise your hands if you feel powerful in your role as a clergy person or a CLP. Raise your hands if you feel powerful. Okay, some of you do, and we'll talk about why that is. Some of you are, I saw one of those, well, sometimes, maybe, yes, right? But some of you, I'm guessing, never feel powerful. I am guessing that if you oftentimes when you step into the pulpit, you feel very vulnerable, which is not surprising. That happens to a lot of us. So we need to talk about what power actually is and what the dynamic of that is in terms of the ministerial relationship. So let's listen to this.
The concept of power is not a negative word. It's like fire. You could either use it to cook a meal or burn a house down. And so the same sense is power, because power is just simply influence and the ability to influence others. And very definitely ministers have power.
I think that we don't really understand the nature of the power that we have in the lives of people that are congregants. I think we often feel powerless, in fact, as clergy persons. In fact, some cases we may feel vulnerable in relationship to the people that come to us.
Being powerful or having power is not about feelings. It's about resources, and either we have resources or we don't have resources. But what they're reflecting, I think, is very real, and it has to do with not feeling in control. And that's a very real feeling in ministry, for better or for worse.
Okay. So when we look at the ministerial relationship, it's important for us to really be clear about what we mean by that, right? Ministerial relationship applies to anybody in a leadership role. So that can be clergy, that can be lay ministers, that can be youth ministers or choir directors or Sunday school teachers or camp counselors. We typically don't do a lot with seminary faculty or administrators. Spiritual directors are in a position of leadership, spiritual teachers. So ministerial relationship really applies to anyone in a leadership role. And for us, power really is about the relationship. It's not about feelings. You heard Marie say, power's not really about how you feel. It is about the role. Now, I will tell you, this can be difficult, particularly in times of conflict. Most of us have been in situations or know of situations where there is conflict between a pastor and members of their congregation, some of whom may be sitting on the session. That's when it becomes really difficult to suss out the power relationships, partly because there are so many feelings involved in that. The feelings get heightened, and so it's really difficult to discern where does the power lie here. And that's why I wanted to spend some time really talking about that, because I think it's important to unpack this a little bit. So power really is about, and you heard Marie say, it's about greater resources and who has the potential for helping or hurting those with less power, right? And then who is the vulnerable one, who has the fewer resources, who has the potential for being helped or hurt by those in more power. Here are some ways you can think about this. Aspects of power versus aspects of vulnerability. For us, primarily, we're talking about the role, and the role of minister or ministerial professional or leader, and versus the congregant or the client is in a more vulnerable position. But the reality is that there are also things that we bring to this that enhance our power and or make us more vulnerable. Sexual identity is one of those, age is one of those, social class, citizenship status, physical resources. And I would include in that not just physical size, but also wealth can be a physical resource. Race can be one of those, gender identity and expression, intellectual resources. By and large, clergy and lay leaders have more training. They're more educated. They have more information about some things, not everything certainly, but some things, than some of the congregants or congregants that we see. So we need to really focus on the relationship to understand the issues of power. I'll give you an example of how this might work in a way that may not seem that way on the surface. So when my daughter was in high school, she was involved in a youth group that had some wonderful leadership. The leadership in this youth group was fabulous. It worked a lot with older people in the church that were in part of that leadership, but also some folks who were some of the leadership for the high school youth group were people who were in college or college age. One day, Katie came home. Katie's my daughter, and she came home and said to me, I am one of the youth group leaders, a young man, is going to pick me up, and we're going to go on campus and deliver cookies to members that he knows in the church, to college age members of the church. Now, my reaction to that was, well, actually, no, you're not. Do that. I said that for a couple of reasons. One, so here is where I saw the power differentials playing out. The youth group leader was older, was male, was driving. My daughter, younger, female, not driving. It was important to her that he had asked her. Now, I need to say going in, I have absolutely no idea. I don't believe at all that this youth group leader had any nefarious purpose in mind. I don't think he did. I think he just thought, well, this will be fun, and Katie's fun to hang out with. We'll go do this. But Katie couldn't see the dynamics, the power differential. The youth group leader obviously wasn't seeing that, but I saw it, right? So my responsibility was to go to the pastor of the church, who, to be fair, at the time, I'm not sure really got it either, but to say, here's why this is not okay. Regardless of the intention of this youth group leader, who I think had every intention of being nice and thoughtful and fun, this created a situation that put my child at risk, whether anything happened or not, right? And so part of what we had to do is look at what's the power differential. Why is this a problem? Well, part of the reason it's a problem is because the youth group leader was older, college age, and my daughter, she was probably 14 or 15 at the time, really liked being singled out by someone as special. You know, he had asked her to do this and not the 15 or 20 other people he could have asked. He'd asked her. And so she felt very special to have been singled out by that. So on the surface, that doesn't seem like that would be problematic, right? But when you start to look at the different aspects of power and the aspects of vulnerability, you can see that it creates a situation where the potential for abuse is pretty significant. Now, there wasn't any, and I don't think there was any intention to be any. But you can see where the creation of the situation was problematic. It's about the role. It's about the office. Now, again, this is not to say that we are always in charge. We're not. It could be times when a member of the session is using their power over a pastor inappropriately. But it's important to remember when you are a leader that just because you feel vulnerable doesn't necessarily mean that you are the vulnerable one. When we talk about this, when a minister or other person with power engages in violating boundaries with a congregant, it's a violation of their role, and it's a breach of fiduciary responsibility. Now, that's usually a term we hear in regards to money. But really, fiduciary has a broader meaning than that. When we think about those violating of boundaries, it's also a misuse of power and authority, taking advantage of vulnerability, and involves an absence of meaningful consent. So again, let's talk about fiduciary duty. What that really means is a duty that is owed to protect, to do no harm, to act in the best interest of those being served. Now, sexualizing or exploiting that relationship clearly violates that role. So who has the fiduciary responsibility, right? And you can see it operate in a couple of different ways. So clearly, a clergy person has a fiduciary responsibility to a congregant, right? That responsibility is to protect, to care for, and so we see that there. It's kind of the one of the ways to think about it is it's the ethical management of the assets of another person or group of people. But also, people in a position, the board, the session, have a fiduciary responsibility to the pastor, right? But also to the congregation. It's about who has the responsibility for caring for the other. Notice that what you don't see, the congregant does not really have a fiduciary responsibility to either the clergy person or the session. Although, we elect people, but it really is about who has a responsibility to act in the best interest of the other. Now, we might hope that the congregation would act in the clergy's best interest. Certainly, we expect that on the part of a session, but really, by and large, that fiduciary responsibility goes in those directions. So how do we manage that, right? Well, one way to do that, to practice that kind of fiduciary responsibility, is by making an agreement to do so. And one of the places that happens, I think, is that having clear job descriptions for pastors, so that the expectations of are clear and are in place, right? Clear job descriptions for pastors and a clear process for evaluation. That can help both pastors maintain their responsibilities to the community, but it can also help the session maintain their responsibilities both to the community and to the pastor, right? So I'm a huge fan of job descriptions. They're important for pastors, so that the expectations are clear. Now, it doesn't have to be a job description. You could have a covenant arrangement that lays out what the expectations are. But the clearest way to manage that fiduciary responsibility is to be clear about it. And that means to write it down. That's just how that makes the most sense. Part of what we know is that congregants, students, people in a more vulnerable position often revere, they defer to power and authority. Not always, certainly, but more often than not, they do. Because that is the relationship, they want to please, they don't want to disappoint. That's what you saw with the example of my daughter and the youth group leader, right? Not a clergy person, but a youth group leader. A younger person, the person who's more vulnerable, wants to please. They don't want to disappoint. And so what that means is they're not really in a position to say no. That reference, that deference allows the more powerful person to maintain or to violate the boundary. And a part of what that means is that, well, I'm going to go back to the video. What you heard the woman say in the video is that because clergy and CLPs too, I think, are invited to be alongside those who are experiencing some of the most challenging life circumstances, it makes that particular point in time very difficult, right? Pastoral counseling can be really fraught, and it can be a landmine, frankly. I think oftentimes when I've seen clergy get in trouble, it starts with what had originally been a pastoral counseling situation, a counseling situation through the crisis that maybe is divorce or the illness of a close family member or a death in the family. And that happens for some really specific reasons, right? And we're going to talk more about why that happens. But the baseline is that parishioners are at their most vulnerable. And when people are at their most vulnerable, when difficult life circumstances are happening, that really compromises clear judgment and decision making. And it means that that parishioner, the person who is most vulnerable, is not in a position to maintain appropriate boundaries, right? We used to describe it when someone has been victimized, and we're not talking necessarily about that, but it's similar, that what often happens is that their boundaries become very permeable because they are in crisis. So when pastors or CLPs are working with someone who is in crisis for whatever reason, that person is not, that's a function of being in crisis. You can't maintain those boundaries. They become very permeable. And so it becomes even more important that the person in the leadership position, the pastor, the lay preacher, the counselor, maintain those boundaries, because the people who are coming for help and assistance can't. So let's say we're gonna do a little what if here. Let's say that you've been providing pastoral care to somebody who's been going through a divorce. You see them regularly in worship, and you've set up times actually during the week to meet with them. But they start calling you at home in the evening just to talk. They are feeling a need for more support, and they call you to talk in the evening. So I'd like you to unmute yourselves, and let's think about what's your responsibility here.
No, I need the alien. Yes, but only one, or else they'll.
Okay, I'm not thinking that that's part of the conversation, what I'm hearing. So, what do you think is your responsibility here to the parishioner?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
Beverly
it could
and
be
then
with-
Brian. Those are the hands I saw. So let's start there.
with who?
Yeah, Beverly.
Me? Okay.
Mhm.
I think you triage it because you
Okay.
need to determine if it's something that's very serious. Are they close to suicide, or they, something to that effect? Did they take a drug? Are they okay? Are they safe? So I think triage it, and then let them know that you care about them, but that you have to, it takes more time than what's required. Maybe schedule an appointment, but it's, but I think you absolutely have to take the call and triage it, or you could be their lifeline and you need to at least respond.
Right. Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. Brian, you're nodding. Do you have something to add to that?
I mean, I like what Beverly says is, that sort of assessment. And usually in my experience, any call I get from congregation members that is after hours is usually in an emergency situation. And I kind of have a pretty set boundary with my congregation that they kind of know that, like, don't call me to chit chat, but again, in this situation was doing this counseling, I mean, again, wanting to have that person to be aware of this is also the boundaries that I have. But if it's not an emergency situation, or if it is an emergency situation, I got to think about how much I can help. If it is something like a suicidal or some sort of substance abuse, it will probably have to be my responsibility that I will have to contact somebody that can help that individual at that time. But I do want to also make it very clear that, hey, this is also my time. I got a wife, I got, kids. You're not going to be knocking on my door or answering, or calling me just to say, hey, I need that line open for emergency only, sort of thing. And if it is, then let's get you the help that we need. Obviously, if it is a health issue, a safety issue, then you need to be calling someone other than me. And I'll make sure that I'll respond in such a way.
Yeah, great. Other thoughts? I'm not seeing hands, so jump in, please. Yeah, I do see Joy's hand, but
I think we have to be aware of what our level of training and expertise is. It can be very tempting to feel like we want to help because those are our feelings, and pastors are by nature inclined to want to help. We tend not to cut off people. But something Brian just said I thought was profoundly wise, that we need to know when to make a good referral. In my own life, I've set the rule early on inside my head and mind that I would pray with people as many as 3 times. I would meet with them as many as for 3 times. And if they still were not evidencing what they themselves thought of as improvement in their inner condition, then I would tell them, I need to make a good referral for you, because prayer alone and my listening to your anguish is not sufficient for helping you.
And that, I mean, what all of you have said, I think, is exactly what we're thinking about. What we did here was you contextualize that, so you're very clear about, is this an emergency? Does this person, rather than just not answering the phone or, answering with, I will talk about it on Tuesday, you spend the time to triage to decide, is this an emergency? Then you're clear about what you can do versus what you cannot do. And then you're also clear about appropriate boundaries. So the boundary setting happens in a variety of ways. It happens when you say, this is my time that I spend in the evenings with my family. But it's also, a boundary is when you say, I'm not prepared. It's not about you. It's that I'm not prepared and I can't be helpful to you in the way that you need me to. So there are lots of good boundaries being set and all the way through in this conversation. So I appreciate that. Beverly, you had something to add?
Yes, I was just going to mention that I tell folks that I am not a counselor, but I am a facilitator. And
Mhm.
I facilitate their being able to express themselves, to get it out, and I will pray with them, and then I will help them make contact. And if need be, I can make the arrangements for them. If they don't know how to make the arrangements or how to get a hold, I can make contact. So getting that information to them, if as Joyce said, prayer and giving them an opportunity to get it off their chest is not enough.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and I think you'll hear this again all through the training. There are a variety of ways to be helpful that we need to sometimes take a step back and think through, rather than just kind of going with an immediate response to the need of the person, right? So, because what the person is identifying as their immediate need, if part of what we have to bring to them is some perspective about how that need can be met, what that need actually is, and whether or not we're the right person to meet it. So all of those are ways that boundaries work for us. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about consent. Partly because I think we misunderstand it, because we assume that the playing field is level, right? Sorry to use a sports analogy, but when we're talking about adults, my example I used of my daughter and youth group leader, obviously there was a disparity there, a variety of disparities in power. But oftentimes when we think about a counseling situation or a situation with a congregant, our assumption is, well, they're adults, right? So there shouldn't be an imbalance of power. But when we think back to the different ways that the chart that we looked at about who has the most resources and who is the most vulnerable, what we can see is that there is an imbalance of power and authority sometimes that has to do with the role or the office, that has to do with other factors that we may not be automatically thinking about. So you can't have consent when there is an imbalance of power and authority. My daughter could not give meaningful consent to and make a good decision on her own to go deliver cookies, get in a car with a college-age young man and go deliver cookies with him, as innocent as that might have been. So But I was in a position to see that she couldn't give meaningful consent because she was responding to the special attention given her by a person who was probably not a lot more powerful, but certainly cooler, was an adult. Again, we've talked about when a person is in a period of vulnerability, there is no such thing as meaningful consent, right? So all those things, the imbalance of power and authority, where the person is in a period of vulnerability and is impaired or has immature judgment, or when they're just responding to special attention given by a powerful person. And again, the issue of consent, there may not be any malicious intent on the part of the person in power. But that's why when we are the person in power, we have to recognize what's happening here, right? We have to recognize whether the context that we're in allows for meaningful consent. And then if it doesn't, we're the ones who have to pull back, right? Does that make sense? Okay, great. All right. So here's some ways to know that. Meaningful consent requires an equality of resources, a lack of coercion, either explicit or implicit, a lack of constraints on choice, requires the self-confidence and maturity to refuse compliance, and not just in sexual situations, in all kinds of situations. And there also needs to be the freedom from punishment, rejection, or shaming if one says no. There is no consent if both parties are not in a position to say no, right? So let's think about this. When I am considering crossing boundaries, the things that we want to ask, the questions we always want to ask ourselves: what is the likely impact on or the potential harm to the congregant, the congregation as a whole, and on our shared mission? Are we doing damage? This seems like a dramatic way to put it, but it's really not. Are we doing damage to the proclamation of the gospel through our behavior? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't mess up. We do, but all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But when we particularly when we think about and when we are considering crossing boundaries, if we don't ask ourselves these questions, we are much more likely to step inappropriately. So these are the questions we always want to ask ourselves. Let's listen to what these folks have to say about risk.
I think it's true that women don't necessarily have the same amount of power as male clergy, especially if they are in an assistant position, especially if they're younger. But all clergy inherently have power. And as soon as we start pretending that we don't have any power, we get into trouble. In the right places at the right times, I have plenty of power. I have been in counseling relationships where this person I'm counseling may be older than me, may be more wealthy than I, all sorts of ways in society that person has more power. But in the counseling relationship, I'm the powerful one. And I know that because they've opened themselves up to me and become vulnerable, and I can help them or hurt them.
For many of us, when we went into ministry, we did so because we wanted to change the way in which ministry had been done and then the ways we had experienced ministry. And we thought it was about power over other people being misused and so forth. And so the answer to that was to not have that power. And to basically say, we're all in this together, we're all equals and so forth. And I think that was naive. I think that it denies the reality of the role, which is a role where we can bring a positive resource, a positive use of power. But if we're coming from a place of, I don't want to have power, that we have anyway, we really don't have a choice about that. It comes with the territory. Any interaction we have with someone is risky. That's why we need to know what we're doing and be thoughtful and careful in the way in which we go about it and sort of the circumstance that we create. A colleague of mine once was called by a congregant to come to visit him at home, and she went. And when she got there, he sexually assaulted her. He was bigger than she was. He was stronger than she was. I mean, it was just, there was no question of kind of boundary crossing. We're talking about criminal assault. So yeah, those kinds of things can happen for the person in the ministerial role. But by and large, under normal circumstances, we're the ones that are in the position to be clear about what the limits of those boundaries are.
Okay. So part of what it makes this challenging for us, frankly, is that we're the ones who are managing it, right? We hope that we will be accountable to other people, but basically we're the ones who have to manage this. So it's important, we talked earlier about self-awareness, and it's important that we be able to ask ourselves some of these questions. Do I ever worry that someone I serve in my role as a pastor isn't able to do without me? That I'm the answer to all their questions? Do I sometimes take over during a congregant's crisis? Do I experience inappropriate excitement from being a confidant? Do I feel special because that person has chosen me to come and to speak to and be vulnerable with? Have I ever confided in a congregant about my marriage or other kinds of personal information that I'm struggling with? Have I ever called a congregant because I needed to hear their voice? Do I ever create situations in which congregants take care of me? Now, the reality is there will be times when congregations, in response and out of love, do take care of you. If a spouse dies, if a child gets sick. So it's not saying that a congregation can never take care of their pastor. Certainly they can, because there is a mutuality there. But do we create situations where that needs to happen, and particularly where our expectation is that a particular congregant will step in and take care of us? That's when it can become a problem. Again, the self-awareness here is really critical. So these are the kinds of things we can ask ourselves to know whether or not we are in danger of violating and acting out some inappropriate boundary crossing. So what I'd like for you all to do, I think we have some, we're going to see if we can divide into small groups. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here because I need to be able to see Susan and make sure that we can do this. What I'd like for you to do, the Zoom will sort you into various small groups. They're random. Once you get in your group, I'd like you to appoint somebody to be the reporter back. And then I'd like for you all to just brainstorm. What are examples of appropriate boundary crossing behavior in congregational life? Because the reality is when you're in a congregation, there are not hard and fast boundaries. And there are some times when boundary crossing is very appropriate. If you are, I'll give you an example of this. If you are paying a pastoral visit on someone who had a family member die, and you go to their house, you're crossing a boundary, but it's very appropriate that you do that, right? So there are appropriate ways to cross, appropriate ways and times to cross boundaries. And then there are inappropriate ways and times to cross boundaries. And then what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes to talk about how do each of those impact the congregation? And do they do it in positive ways, or does the boundary crossing do it in problematic ways, have negative consequences? So here's what I want you to do. Brainstorm positive boundaries crossing, brainstorm inappropriate boundary crossing, and then talk for a few minutes about the ways that those impact a congregation. Does that make sense? Yes? Nod. If you just nod, thumbs up, any of those. Okay, good. Thank you. So Susan we're going to take about 10 minutes to do this. We will sort you into your small group. And then if any of you who have been in small groups on Zoom know that you'll get some notices about when your time is almost up, and then you will be yanked back into the large group where we will process this. It's a little bit, I think about it like the time travel in Harry Potter, you're just magically yanked back into the large group. So that's what we're trusting the small group technology to do for us. So Susan, are we good with that?
Yeah. How many groups do you want?
I think we can probably do 3.
Okay. And I'm going to pause the recording for this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So in the small group I was in, I need to just be quiet because we didn't get to as much on that I had hoped about the impact within a congregation. So somebody raise your hand and tell us what you all talked about in your group. Yeah, Beverly.
Okay. We agreed that it was much easier to talk about inappropriate boundaries, so we tried to focus more on appropriate boundaries. And the first idea that came forth was to make an appointment to go and talk to somebody as opposed to just showing up and being more casual. That way it keeps it more less a friend and mutual sharing. It's more you're going there for a specific purpose, and that in itself can set a boundary. Also, sometimes when you're helping somebody and you're working and you're going down a path of helping them, at some point it may turn and become where you realize that what you're doing is now not helping them, or they're not being as honest with you. And how do you then backpedal and make sure that you get yourself out of a situation? And setting some of those boundaries up front of how far you're willing to go to help somebody. And I'm talking about maybe going to immigration with them, or going to helping them fill out paperwork, those kinds of things. And if you get into a conversation, they think you're like a lawyer, that everything you say is confidential, but there are certain things as mandated reporters we are required to mention. So we should stop. I do anyway. I stop them and say, I'm a mandated reporter, and anything you say to me will be reported. I just want you to know that. Now, that may stop them from telling me something, but then at the same time, I'm not violating what they think is a trust. And I let them know right up front that I'm not going to keep that secret. That they can't just tell me any secret and have it stop with me. And I think, was there anything else from our group, or did that get it?
I think you covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Nancy. Oh, you're muted, Nancy.
We spent more time on the appropriate types of visits, and we talked about visiting people in the hospital and nursing homes. That's crossing some kind of a boundary at times, but it's a necessary visit. Visiting the homebound, talked about taking communion to the homebound, that kind of thing. And we sort of mentioned that in some types of situations, it's really good to go in pairs. 2 by 2, we go out, and especially whenever we're doing communion or anything like that in someone's home. And someone mentioned that, if possible, to meet and to avoid the perception of something, to meet in a public place where there are other people around, that type of thing. When there's an emergency, we have to go. If there's somebody's in an automobile accident, something awful happened, you have to go. And then you can address later on, maybe somebody coming with you, that type of thing. Brian mentioned that I thought it was really good as to when we talked about going out in 2s, if that's not possible, at least let somebody else know what you're doing. I'm going to visit so-and-so tonight. Let a session member know so that they know what's going on too. And make sure that people know that you're there to listen. You're not there to solve their problems. You can't do that in one visit. You're not there to judge, you're there to listen to them. And you're, as Beverly said, everything isn't confidential. We aren't in the confession booth here. So you have to be careful of that line to cross.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So I think Matt wrote down some of the things that we talked about in our group.
Yep, yeah, we had a lot of similar things for the appropriate, a lot of this visiting hospital visits, going to people's homes when invited, talked about going to youth events of people in the congregation, sporting events or plays and so forth. Just basically being where you're invited, and some of the inappropriate things could be similar type visits if they're going the other way, you know, going, maybe overstaying your welcome when you are at a home or in the hospital, or you know, we had one of the appropriate things was giving someone a hug, say at a funeral when they want it, but an inappropriate thing could be hugging people when it's not welcome and they don't want a hug. Also, that could be inappropriate is being careful about giving rides to people or having people in your car. If that could put you in a bad situation. Often texting or social media could potentially get, Fuzzy Nan said we're going to talk about that a little later. And we also had an example of, you know, just showing if your pastor has a manse, just going into the house because you think the church owns it and you can just get going whenever you feel like it. And, you know, setting boundaries on physical space like that as well. And all those things can lead to, you know, a lack of trust or division in the congregation if some of these boundaries are crossed inappropriately.
And others feel free to jump in, but one of the things that I was thinking about as we were finishing our conversation was the comment that Jimmy Hurd made in the video about power, is that power is actually a neutral thing and that it can be used to, you know, cook a meal that lights like fire. You can use it to cook a meal or burn a house down. And I thought for some of these things, that what makes them, again, appropriate and inappropriate are the context, right? And the judgment. That's part of what we heard. But so some of these things, like visiting, can build trust in a congregation, but if they're misused, they can destroy trust in a congregation, right? Did you all talk at all or have time to talk about how some of these things impacted or might impact congregations, either in a positive way or in ways that were problematic?
Didn't really get there.
Yep, I think that happens. There's a lot. There's a lot in that 10 minutes. Yeah, Nancy, did you?
We just briefly said that, you know, an inappropriate relationship or inappropriate contact can really crush a congregation. And that comes back to power and everything else that we've just talked about. And another thing, sometimes we have power and we don't perceive that we do. And I think that's a concern. An example I can use from my working life was I worked in a situation where I was equal to those that I was working with, and then I was promoted to be their supervisor, but I still acted as though, you know, as though I was part of the group. And my supervisor had to say to me, they perceive you differently now. I didn't myself, but I think we have to be careful about that.
I think that is absolutely key, Nancy. I think you're absolutely right. That again, it goes back to the power's about, and we need to look at what is the role and what is the relationship and how's it defined, not how do we feel about it. Because it's not uncommon for us to feel like we don't have any power, and my feelings about these people that I'm relating to haven't changed. But if the role is different, then we have to pay attention to that. I think that's a great example. So, all right, my clock says it's 10:22. Let's all take a break, get up, walk around, touch your toes, do whatever you need to do. And let's plan to come back here at, we'll say 10:32. I want to make sure I give you 10 minutes for sure. And then we'll keep on rolling. But is that okay? People can take a break. I think we're gonna Thank you. We're going to jump back in and talk a little bit about dual relationships. Basically, a dual relationship is when the relationship involves more than
To adjust the amount taken out.
one or more role.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to mute
200?
again,
An extra 100.
Yeah.
Okay.
so we're not getting feedback. So mute your mics, please. Thank you. All right. So a dual relationship basically means you've got it, it's exactly what it says there. That means you relate to people in a couple of different ways, right? So your let's say one of your parishioners is also your dentist, right? That's an easy way to think about that. It's a dual relationship, but it's probably one that's fairly easy to manage. So we're going to talk a little bit about those next. I am going to, oh shoot. Okay, let me try this again. I didn't, unfortunately, share my screen, so this is going to take me a minute to get back where I need to be. Sorry. Apparently I have to do this in the right order or it doesn't work. So let me see. And I want to do this now. So now I can't, I'm losing my view of all of you, which I don't want to do. So hang on a minute. Let's try this way. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. And then I'm going to go here. Then I'm going to do, all right, I'm going to stop sharing a minute until I get this straightened out and then I'll come back. This is just a little more complicated than my little brain can manage. It's not showing me what I need to see. Let's see here. Go. All right, you're back. All right, I am not sharing my screen just yet, but damn it. I appreciate your patience as I figure this out in the order I need to do it. So, okay. Let's do this. The screen I want you to see is that one. Okay. All right. Well, this will not giving me the notes I want. Hang on a minute. I apologize.
And however you just had it, I think was correct.
I know. I'm just trying to figure out here. I need to figure out how to share the screen I want to share. So we're going to try this again. I can make it work, I think, if I do this. Sorry. I'll do that. Okay. That is not exactly what I needed, but it will work. So for the time being, it will work. So let's see if we can, if you're not able to see the video, let me know and we'll figure it out.
And then she started to leave and then got to the door and then turned around and came back to me and just
It's
embraced
not
me.
showing the video again, Ian.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of.
And,
Okay.
and all she meant by that was she was expressing the hope and the desire that our pastoral relationship was a healthy one. She didn't mean anything other than that, I'm convinced. What I had to attend
So
to
this is-
were my
Oh
own
my goodness, I've got
attractions
several going
and
here. A
my
minute.
own
Wait a minute.
feelings when this embrace occurred. Big
Okay. Now, let's try this again. Where are my zoomies? There we are. All right. I need to get this straightened out. Change this. And then. Yeah, I think my problem right now is that I can't see you all, so I don't, and if I can't see you, I can't change my, I can't do that. I can't do my screen. I can't share my screen. So, all right.
And I don't think you have to see us to share your screen. You
No,
might be sad that you're not seeing
right.
our
No,
reaction.
no, no. I think, but the problem is if I can't see what's going on in the Zoom, which I can't if I do this, then I can't see.
Last time you didn't do full screen. We just had the smaller picture.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's just not. All right. Let's try this again. It's about the order in which I do it, I think. Let's see what happens. Yeah, see, it's doing that. I don't want to do that.
I'm okay hearing it without seeing it. If
Well,
that,
it really is just talking heads. It's not really that so much as it's what I need to be able to do to share the screen, because we're going to be doing some stuff here in a minute. So, and I can't, this is ridiculous. I'm sorry, because I had it a minute ago and it was working just fine. Shoot. Gotta get back here, do mine. All right. We will, I will make this work. We will share the screen and we may just listen to the videos. And you'll have to trust that I know what I'm doing. All right. I think that's where we want to be. Okay. All right. You all are seeing the screen, right? Dual relationships. So I'm not sure that you're going to be able to see the conversation, but it's people talking, so you're not missing anything. And it's more important that we get to the case studies, which are next. So, okay, let's try this.
and then she started to leave and then got to the door and then turned around and came back to me and just embraced me, just a full embrace. And all she meant by that was she was expressing the hope and the desire that our pastoral relationship was a healthy one. She didn't mean anything other than that, I'm convinced. What I had to attend to were my own attractions and my own feelings when this embrace occurred, because I felt she was attractive and the embrace felt good.
The pastor always, that's part of the power, that we always have the responsibility to say no to set the boundary. It's not up to the parishioner. It is our job.
Point what I said is that I don't want there to be a problem between us either, because it's important to me that I be your pastor. So that framed it for her sake, but also for my sake. The pastor was intentional in her desire to empower the parishioner. If we're going to pursue this relationship, then I can't be your pastor. And you're going to have to find another pastor. Do you want that to happen? And it gave the choice over to him. She immediately went to talk to the bishop. So the bishop knew what was going on. The bishop could give advice.
It is one of those wonderful landmines. It's not illegal. It's not necessarily unethical, but it's full of potential problems.
Oh, look, I've been updated to the newest version. That's not what we want. Let's do this. There we go. All right. Okay. All right. Here we go. We are going to do some small group work again. What we're going to do is divide into 3 groups. I will leave this screen up. You all can see the case study screen, yes? Okay. Because it's hard for me to know which breakout group you're in. I think you can go by 1, 2, and 3. I think it tells you which group you're in, which is helpful. So if you are 1, please talk about the first case study. If you're in group 2, talk about the second. Group 3, talk about the third. Please do the same thing you did before. Identify somebody in your group to report back. Discuss the scenarios, identify problems or concerns, but really what I want you to do is problem solve. I want you to think about, what do you do, right? These are not outrageous situations, so think about what are your options here. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to give it 5 to 8 minutes, and then I will yank you back into the big group, and you all can share what you came up with, what your solutions are. All right, Susan, are you still there? I see your head, so you must be still there. Can you put us into the groups, or you want me to do it? Why don't you let me try it? Since we're.
Hold on for 1 second.
What's up, Brian?
The groups 1, 2, and 3. We're going to be divided into groups. Now, just so you guys know, when we go into our small groups, you're not going to see what the question you're going to have, because this screen won't be there. So is it possible that we can get these questions written? Either we can write it down into the messaging, or if everybody just take a picture with your phone, which I just did.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. I still see it, so I didn't know that you all didn't see it. So
yeah, when we break into small groups, this will disappear.
Yeah. So Brian's suggestion's a good one. If you all can take a picture with your phone of the slide, I'm sure there is a technological way we could do this, but I don't know what it is. Take a picture of this with your phone, and then you'll have them. Are we good? Yes.
I'm gonna leave now, Ian.
Okay, thank you. I will put people into the group. Let's think, well, where did it go? Oh, there it is. Come on. Sorry about that. It moved here. There we go. All right, here we go.
They misread the question or the situation.
Yeah.
All right. So let's, how'd we do there? Group 1, do you have a recorder?
That would be me. We really didn't get real far. We talked about, you know, this type of situation, and one of us had that kind of thing happen. And so, the way it was handled was, in a very direct way, felt that he or she had to be very direct and just say that they were uncomfortable with this much attention, wanted to be equal treatment among all the congregants and not have favoritism, that kind of thing. So that's basically where we got on that, is that the direct approach with soft language, with, you know, carefully worded, is probably the best approach.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You don't want to hurt someone's feelings.
Right.
And you also don't know what the motivation here might be. It could be that that the person who is visiting is just very lonely. And so part of what you might want to do is to explore that a little bit and offer some other alternatives. Maybe they're just nice and know that you're new to town and just want to help you get acclimated. But again, that it can get fuzzy when you are being friends with one or more members of the congregation and other people wonder why you're not being so friendly with them.
I do think you have to recognize in this particular case study, this is a rural culture. And so even though that is not appropriate, you have to go, I understand this is the culture, and this is really the boundaries by which pastoral relationships are set. But you appreciate what they're trying to do because it mimics the whole culture, but it's not appropriate for the church relationship.
Right. And I think that's a really important distinction, Kathy, to make, because all of these have cultural contexts, right? And to just shut it down without understanding that, I think one would probably make it very difficult to be a pastor in that setting. And so you just have to be clear, these are the boundaries I need to maintain, but I understand why you are approaching it in a different way. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Good point. Group 2. Anybody from group 2?
Does anybody mind if I?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, our first thought, is like, thank you. But to get a big discount on a vehicle when you're financially strapped and your vehicle's dying and the owner of the dealership is in your congregation and he offers to give you a good deal on a car. But at the same time, we really we don't know what the motive is behind that. And we don't want to put ourselves in a position where we have to respond in kind or in some way. And there's also, what if you get a car, even if you paid full price and you started having problems with the car, you didn't like the service you were getting, how do you respond? At the end, we just thought we would decline very politely, explaining that for various reasons, we think it best that we go to somebody else, nothing personal, but we go to another dealership.
Because, yeah, I think you're right. The potential, it's not that there's a problem in and of itself, but the potential for problems is significant. If the car doesn't work, is there an expectation that you will buy every car for the rest of the duration of your pastorate from that person? is there an expectation on their part that this this creates a special relationship? So there's a lot of potential. I think the case study sort of indicates this, but what do you think are what's the pull here? What is the pull to, when you're in a financial bind and this seems like a parishioner may be able to help you get out of that. How do
At
you
first
say
glance,
no?
at first glance, it's almost like a godsend, like an answer to prayer. It's a relief and you think, wow, but that's where sin gets you. You know, right where you're the most vulnerable. And right now you are vulnerable and you need something and they're willing to fill a need. And it's a really tough call. But there are some serious downsides to it.
Thinking about the rural area though, I mean, you know, if you live in Curwensville and there's only one car dealer in Curwensville and that person is on your session or, you know, part of your church and they want to help you and you say to them, you know, gosh, this is very, you know, generous, but I really think that it would be better for me to buy my car from somebody in DuBois. I mean, you know, I think you risk really insulting a person that wanted to help you.
Oh, it's hard.
I would think that, you know, that there would be some level where, you know, maybe just disclosure and kind of setting some guidelines in writing would allow you to, you know, accept a gift, but that would, you know, maybe prevent some further expectations. I mean, maybe you go to the session and you say, you know, so-and-so member has offered this to me. You know, it appears to be, you know, really maybe below their cost or you know, at a level that would be less than a normal church member would pay. You know, this is the perfect car for my family. I'd like to accept the gift, but I want to disclose that to the session so that the session doesn't feel that I'm doing something behind the scenes, you know. And if the session says, hey, this is a bad idea, we don't want to do this, or then maybe the session would give you better counsel. You know, maybe if you accept the car to purchase it, you lay out, you know, look, I don't have any expectations. I'm not expecting free oil changes. I'm not expecting you to treat me any different in the service department than any other customer. You know, you know, but in the meantime, you know, you know, it is a gift, and I'm assuming that you're giving it with no strings attached. You know, that I can't recognize I can't reciprocate this gift, so I'm going to accept it as a gift, but I'm not. Please don't. If there's you know, let's not have this continue into some weird relationship. I don't know. I think you could handle that. I don't know.
Todd, I think you make a really good point. Is there a place between absolutely not and, oh yeah, great, that we can set some other boundaries and put some other boundaries in place? Dennis, I think you had your hand up. Sorry, you just took a drink. You're muted.
Well, I mean, Todd's sort of approach about saying, even if you're going to just say no, if you don't think, you know, you think it's going beyond the boundary you don't want to cross. I think it would be good though that you did tell the session, or at least someone on the session, that, hey, this is what's going on, but I don't feel it's appropriate for me to accept this. Just so the person, this gentleman that's making you the offer, you say no, they get very, very upset. And boy, what an unfriendly pastor this is. Do we want him? Do you have somebody sort of understanding your side of the view before it goes on?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think in that way, that's a really good way to use your session. Some larger churches actually have personnel committees, but I know that's not true for every church. But you can use your session as hopefully a group of people that you can brainstorm with, that you can say, here's my dilemma around this, and I could use your input, I could use your help. What are the things we need to make sure we put in place to make this feel like this is going to be okay for everybody. I think that's a really good suggestion as of a way to use your session to help with this. And if the person who wants to give you the good deal on the car is a member of your session, identify one or two other people that you could go to and sort of brainstorm with that, rather than making it a full session discussion, which could be awkward. Other thoughts about this?
Well, that way too, if you shared it with your session, you might find out that he has done this a lot with other members of the congregation that were
Good
in,
point.
desperate need, because this person was in desperate need. 4 kids and a 10-year-old vehicle breaks down, and here was a van being offered. So if it's something that is normally for someone in charge of in the ownership of an establishment like a vehicle,
Right.
can't beat it.
And Trish, I think you make a good point. If this has been a pattern in this church, one, if it's had good result, people may be able to tell you that, and that's not necessarily information you would have had. If it's had negative results, people can raise that and say, this happened once before and it was really a red flag and it created all kinds of problems and we don't want to go down that road again. And again, one of the things that a session has that often pastors don't is historical context, right? You have a pastoral context, but your session has a historical context. So they've been around for a while and they've seen pastors come and go. And so they may have a different understanding of that. I think that's a really good point. Okay, group 3. What do you got?
Well, we had an interesting one, a 28-year-old pastor that is attracted to a similarly aged congregant and wants to ask them out. And that there's more than one layer of this, because in addition to that, their parents, who are also members of the congregation, have been inviting the pastor over to their house a lot. And it seems like, reading between the lines, maybe they're trying to even set the pastor up with their child here. And first glance, we're like, well, you can't be someone's pastor and be in a relationship with them. And then we had the conversation, well, what about this is what, maybe this is God's will, maybe this is what God wants, and maybe it'll work out fine. But then if it doesn't work out fine, what happens if there's a breakup then? And that could really throw the congregation into turmoil. And, the speaker before that we listened to said, you can't really be a pastor and in a relationship with someone at the same time. But in these rural areas, like we're talking about, how does the logistics of how that could play out? You can't just necessarily say, well, I'll just go be a pastor at a different church so I can explore this relationship. Or it seems like there could be a lot of pitfalls to going any further with this, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not clear cut. And there may be, from the congregants, a lot of expectations, thinking of some of our congregations, if you see 2 young people that just happen to be single, maybe like, oh, isn't this great? And we're going to set them up and they're going to get married and have 50 kids for the congregation. This is going to be wonderful. And, there's probably some of that going on too. So,
Yeah, I think it's a multi-layered issue, right? And that's, again, I'm thinking back to the questions that we have to ask. What's the potential impact on the people, the direct people involved, but what's then the potential impact on the congregation, both positive and negative? So other thoughts about this? This is particularly an issue in small rural churches, and that oftentimes are not so much anymore, but when I graduated from seminary, it was not uncommon for small rural parishes where single people ended up, and that's where they started their ministry. And there was some isolation that they experienced, but also, so people were faced with this. Bob, you've got your hand up, and I can see it. That's good to know.
I was just testing it. No, I just wanted to say, it sounds like we're seeing a good recurring theme here of using session appropriately when you have any doubt. And the one thing I thought of is, I guess, to make sure that when we go to session, we're going to the session in its role as session, versus just grabbing a session member on the side and saying, hey, because that may feel more like, collegial advice, versus saying, okay, we either need to call session, or at the next session meeting, we need to have this formally addressed. Just a thought.
I think that is right on point. I think that's a really good suggestion because again, all of your session members are members of the congregation, right? And you want to avoid developing a sort of a special relationship. You know, you don't want them to put them in a position where they become your confidant. You want the role of the session needs to be clear that this is about helping you manage your role as the pastor. I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Although now it leads me to a follow-up. What if the person in question is a member of session?
Well, yeah. And I think that can happen, you know, in smaller
Yeah.
churches, that can happen. That's why I think, again, I wouldn't necessarily, if that's in that situation, go to one other member of the session, but you might ask 1, 2, or 3 other members of the session to sort of sit down in their role as session members and say, you know, this is why I don't want to talk about this in a session meeting because it involves other people, but I need you as session members, plural, to provide some guidance here. That kind of avoids the special relationship issue a little bit.
No, thanks. That makes sense.
Yeah. Other thoughts about this? Any of the scenarios that we've read?
I just had one thought that I think sessions are usually very happy to have a pastor and they want to keep the pastor. And so they will think of ways of doing that, finding them a mate, finding them a car, and all of that may be part of really just wanting to see the best for their pastor so they can keep their pastor. But what you said right at the beginning is one of the ways of establishing boundaries is writing it down. And there might be a discussion. Well, we realize you really are having a hard time with 4 kids and a car that you can't handle. Let's write into the contract that for this year only, we will give you such and such an amount of money to buy a new car, something like that. You know, find a way that it can be written down that it comes from the greater group rather than an individual.
I think, Eli, I think that's a really good idea because I think we get locked into solutions. These are the only 2 solutions I can think of. When in fact, if we opened it up a little bit, there may be some other solutions, and that's the benefit, I think, of taking things to the session is you've got more creative brains working on it because they do want to keep you. They do want you to be happy. So some handy hints here. Oh, there we go. And I think that these can be used really all across the board. When we're talking about dating, you should inform and refer. And by inform and refer, I think it means tell the people to whom you are accountable, your session. And also best case scenario is that when there's a romantic relationship, you should not serve as that person's partner. I do want to ask though, and I'm throwing this out to the group, because it's not ever been my experience. My husband and I have been a clergy couple for years. So we've never been in a position of being married and one of us serving a church that the other one then participates in as a parishioner. And I know that has been the case for some of you. So I'm asking you, those of you who have had that experience, what has that been like? And how have you managed that? How have you navigated that? Feel free to jump in because I'm not seeing you anymore.
I haven't had that experience.
Have any of the others of you had it?
Wait, I'm sorry, and I was having a little bit of trouble tracking. So you're asking if you're a pastor and your spouse is attending the church
Right.
that you're pastoring?
Yeah, how do you manage that? When you can't be there, you can't be both their pastor and their spouse. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I am in that situation. And I do have the benefit of having some friends and associates who, if there is an issue that is sensitive, my wife can talk to them. So I think it is about, utilizing your network. And in terms, I have noticed in the congregations that I've served, there have been different expectations for the pastor's wife or the pastor's spouse. And I've been very clear in my call interviews about the notion you're calling me, you're not calling my spouse or my family, and they will participate in the life of the congregation as they feel called by God to participate. But that doesn't mean, you know, my kids are going to be your Sunday school program or your VBS program, or my wife's going to do, you know, Lenten lunches. If they want to do those things, they can. But I thought upfront communication about that right off the bat is very critical. So in one of my churches, the previous pastor's spouse didn't participate at all. So the fact that my spouse was in worship was kind of like, oh, hey, this is great. So it's a very low bar, I guess you could say. And in other situation, in my current situation, it's been very different depending on who was the pastor. But that's always been part of the call process for me.
Well, and I think, Brett, what you indicate is one of the things that we've been talking about all the way along is, are the expectations clear? Because that's when we get in trouble, is when they're not clear, when the expectations aren't clear, and part of that is, are they written down? You know, I mean, is that in writing somewhere? Because I think it's our memories are a little faulty, and sometimes we remember what we want to remember. But I also know that, again, it's really about, are the expectations clear about what your role is and what your role is in relationship to the congregation. So I think that's really important. I'm going to put that back up. I'm hopeful. Are you all seeing the screen that says dating, friends, and dual relationships?
No.
Nope, you're not. Okay. Then we're going to need to go back in here and reshare. How about now? Yes?
No.
Nope. Okay. That I'm going to have to go back into Zoom and reshare my screen. So let me do that. I can do that. I think it kicks me out of sharing at times. So
While you're doing that, if I could share,
please jump in.
Yeah, well, you do whatever you have to do. I had an interesting situation because my husband was the spouse. So it wasn't a female, which you usually had a role that the female pastors' wives carried. And for me, it wasn't a issue of the church setting boundaries with the church. It was setting boundaries with my husband because he wanted to do everything and be involved in everything. And it was like, this is not an appropriate place for you to be, in. So it was kind of interesting. It was fun. It was fun. He was good, and he's a good hard worker, but sometimes he had to be pulled back.
And you ended up probably being the one who had to do that.
Oh, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yeah. And nobody else saw it. I'm the one that saw that it was, in a inappropriate place.
Yep. All right. Yeah. So I think these are great examples that, and again, I think the things kind of helpful hints to remember with dual relationships: inform and refer, clear expectations. When it comes to friendships in the congregation, spread the wealth. Now, you're not going to like everybody the same way. You're going to be friendlier with some people than others, but insofar as it's possible, maintain the same kinds of relationships with everybody in the congregation. So the folks who aren't in the inner circle, or who don't, so that people don't perceive that there's a circle to be in, right? That's what you want to avoid. If you do have dual relationships, like with the car dealer, see if you can minimize and manage those. Again, all of these, use your session appropriately. And generally speaking, with gifts, keep it simple. That's going to be the best thing. It's about accountability. Honesty is the best policy. And if you're clear about what's okay, it's going to be easier for your parishioners. And if you're not clear, identify those folks you can go to that can help you think it through. Okay. All right. Okay. I want to have some specific conversations about the pulpit and transference and touch. These are very specific areas, but I think they're important for us to cover. Oh, look, there's a typo. And I think it's important for us to talk about these. So I'm going to see again, if you may just get the sound, I'm hoping that you'll get the video, but we will see here. Looks to me like we're going to get video.
But everybody gazing up at me adoringly where I preached this stupendous sermon. And so I tried to press her a bit. Well, we do preach, but there's a lot of other things going on. And it became clear that she had this kind of idealized vision of ministry where she would be looked up to, where she could be on stage. And so we actually, it was a student, we actually counseled with her. And she ultimately, interestingly enough, left the ministry and went into acting and is now in Los Angeles trying to be an actress.
Ministry is not acting, but it does involve assuming a role. That role, one of spiritual teacher or pastoral counselor, defines our motives and our actions within a professional capacity.
Coming this Sunday, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, starring Reverend Jonathan Edwards.
I think when we use the pulpit for our own personal agenda, we've crossed a line.
That perhaps there's an issue that's going on in the board, and for whatever reason, the pastor is not able to find clear communication and resolution. And suddenly, Old Testament passages, especially from Leviticus, starts to just flow freely from the pulpit. And what happens is that the ministry of the word then becomes agenda-driven communication. And in many ways, pulpits are frequently used as passive-aggressive weapons.
Whose needs am I there to meet when I'm preaching to people?
Trying to promote themselves, trying to prove how good or smart. We are all in danger of doing that. That's a constant temptation. I fight it. It's very easy to want to make myself sound good. I work against it. It's very easy to make myself the star of my own story.
People who have a presence, even folks who are dramatic, there's a real role for that. The caution would be is it focused on me as a pastor, or are we simply sort of transmitting the message of the church, the love of God for somebody?
You can manipulate people emotionally. And in fact, sometimes that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Sometimes our job as clergy is to be prophets, and that means saying things that they're not ready to hear, they don't want to hear. There's a lot of power there. There's a lot of opportunity to go over a line.
One Sunday, without consulting the parish council or anybody else, he purchased with parish funds 800 copies of the book Bread for the World, and he put them in the pews. And then he stood up on Sunday and preached to the people a very scolding kind of homily. The readings were very appropriate, but what he did with the readings was basically to say, you're all rich people and you're all overfed and overstuffed and you're all overweight and you need to give more money, and I want you to purchase these copies of the Bread for the World and give extra money to World Hunger Today. At the end of the 4 Sunday liturgies, most of the copies of Bread for the World were still in the pews. They hadn't bought them, and the people voted with their feet and voted with their lives.
I think scolding sermons don't work, for one thing, and they make people pretty angry. And I've had people angry because I've challenge them on a justice issue, but I've tried not to attack them personally.
The pulpit certainly is a valuable resource in terms of a public opportunity to present our ideas, to promote ideas, to encourage and support and challenge people. But there's a fine line between that and an agenda which is in effect self-serving.
When you put on those robes, you are saying something about your role in the world and your role in the community. And then the community is saying, oh, who's this guy? And you become a wonderful, say, target for projection.
Okay. There we go. So the pulpit is, first of all, let me see. Are you all seeing the slide? Yes? Okay, good. The pulpit really is a tool that can be used for both positive and negative ends. Obviously, you heard some of those. The positive things, we proclaim the gospel. Sometimes that means we are prophetic. Sometimes that means we don't always necessarily say things that if from the pulpit, what we say is agreed to by everybody in the congregation all the time, then we're probably missing some things, right? On the other hand, when we begin to substitute our belief system, our perspective for the gospel, then it's a problem. When we begin to use the pulpit to further our own agenda, and I think one of the people in the video mentioned this, if there's a conflict in the congregation and all of a sudden, and I've heard people do this, it seems as if the sermon becomes sort of targeted to address the problem. That's an issue. And I will confess to having done this myself, hopefully back in the day when I didn't know as much as I know now, but when I've used the pulpit to further my own political agenda, that thinking that my political agenda was in line with the gospel, but not being clear about where those boundaries were. Promoting ourselves as in drawing attention to how cool we are in the pulpit. I don't see that as a big problem, at least in our congregations. I do think, though, that sometimes, and this is a struggle, to really hold ourselves accountable when we are in the pulpit, so that we are not giving in to them temptations to cross boundaries and make our perspectives substitute those for the good news in the gospel. That this seems like an odd thing, but one of the things that is supposed to help us do that is the prohibition of and our IRS status as non-exempt, and non-profit, which means that we don't use the pulpit for political ends, right? That seems like something that's way outside this context, but it can serve as a reminder that our job is not that, right? So here's some things I think that can be helpful with this. One is to contextualize. Who are the hearers? Who are you preaching to? What do they need to hear from you? Now, some of that may be some things that they don't necessarily like, but some of it, my guess, is they need to hear the good news. One of my sermon professor way back in the day always said, where is the good news in your sermon? And you need to that's what your hearers need from you. That may be the compassionate love of God. That may be the call to be peacemakers. That may be the call to care for those who are the least of these. What do your hearers need from you? And then I think to say, what are the scriptures saying? Now, all of us, I think, try to do that, but there are some really concrete ways that you can hold yourself accountable to that. One is to say, did I look at the commentaries, or did I look at the scripture passage and just write a sermon based on what I think it says? Did I look at the commentaries? Have I looked at the historical context, the literary context? Am I using the lectionary, or am I preaching on my favorite passages all the time because I really like those, or because I think people should hear them or like them as much as me? I will tell you that using the lectionary is a discipline. I'm hoping that you all know what the lectionary is. Using the lectionary is a discipline that I think really helps us stay focused on the message of the gospel. And it keeps us, as much as it can, it keeps us from substituting our ideas and our agendas for what the scripture is saying. So I'm a huge fan of using the lectionary, partly because I think it is a way to hold myself accountable. I'll also say very practically, as is the case in our presbytery, when you've got pastors who change in churches every Sunday, when you have a church that uses supply ministers every Sunday, if you know that those folks are working through the lectionary, chances are you're not going to hear a sermon on John 3:16 4 times in a row, right? So there are some practical ways that it keeps us accountable, but there are also, I think, it's a good spiritual self-discipline to use the lectionary and use the commentaries that I would encourage all of you to use. Those of you who've been preaching for a long time or not so long time, thoughts about the pulpit and what our role is there. Anybody have anything they'd like to share?
You mentioned earlier, Ann, about kind of defining fiduciary responsibility, and I think that term is relative to the word, the gospel. We have a fiduciary responsibility to the word that's been given to us, and certainly in a preaching scenario or writing or anytime we're sharing the word, that's a really high calling. I mean, that's probably our highest calling is to treasure the word and to deliver it, in its pure form.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I'm glad you circled us back to that idea of fiduciary responsibility, because it really is about the people to whom we have been charged to care for. That's so fiduciary is a good way to think about that. Other thoughts?
I have a more simplistic view.
Yeah, jump in, Tricia.
I used to come home from church, and my husband, who is not a church goer, would say to me, "So what was the sermon about?" And I could not tell him what the sermon was about, even though I'm there every Sunday. And there was very few times I could tell him what the sermon was about. And so my main goal when I'm in the pulpit is to give a sermon led by the Holy Spirit that will help people remember what the sermon was about, what's the main issue, and what are you talking about, and make it memorable so that you can live it the rest of the week and the rest of your lives, if that be.
I think that's a good goal. I think it's a very good goal. I used to I have listened to some pastors preach, usually more inexperienced ones, who maybe because they didn't preach often, it felt like they were trying to tell me every single thing they'd ever learned about anything. And it was hard to sort through what's the point. So I think it's where's the good news here? So yeah, Nancy, you popped up, so I'm assuming that you.
Yeah, I've been watching or listening to all this and thinking in terms of what I do as we talk about, itinerant preachers. And so there's an advantage and a disadvantage to that. The advantage is that you don't really get into the political problems that are in that congregation. You're not even aware of them. But the other part is you also you don't know those people well, that if there was a need that you could address. So I see a lot of what I'm seeing here today is like for for our commission pastors or for our ordained pastors, where you do get involved in that and you have to guard against how much you get involved. That's my perspective.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we do have folks, and that includes me, who drop into churches to preach and lead worship, but really don't know the dynamics of those congregations at all. And so there are very different kinds of ways to approach, I think, what you do in the pulpit, and really in some ways all of these issues, based on whether you are embedded in a congregation or not. I think the issues become a little bit different. So I think that's an important point for us to remember. So my original plan was to talk about transference and hugging and use the videos, but I'm not sure that that's going to work as well as I might like. So we're going to talk a little bit about transference, and the other one's just using the slide deck. And I will tell you a big secret I found out when I was working on this is, and you'll learn this at the end, all of the videos in their entirety are available through the YouTube channel of the Faith Trust Institute, and they're free. So if any of you want to go back and re-listen to something or listen to the whole context, you can absolutely do that. So, but right now we're gonna do this. So part of the reason transference is put in this section, a transference is really about, it's a term that is used often in counseling relationships, and because counselors need to pay attention to it, both transference and countertransference. But transference is really confusing feelings that one has about one person with feelings that you have about another. One of the examples that I think that is used in the video is to talk about, it is not uncommon, and this is true for both male clergy and female clergy, for congregants to begin to relate to you, not as a pastor, but as a father or as their mother. Now, part of that in other traditions is kind of linked to the way that they are referred to, clergy are referred as father or mother, but it's also part of what happens is that in a society where or in a context, in a family context, where there may have been an absent father or a father that was not emotionally available, to then for some people to have an experience of a clergyman who is emotionally available, who is loving and compassionate, that may be something that a congregant has longed for, right? So it may mean that while they're standing in front of you, looking at you, actually relating to you, the feelings that are being elicited for them are not really about you. And I know that is a little bit confusing for folks, but that happens all the time in a counseling relationship, where because intimacy, various kinds of intimacy are easily confused, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But it means that while it seems as if they are talking to you, the feelings that they're feeling are probably less about you than you think they are. So the very first line on the slide, a congregant's interaction with us is often not about us at all, right? I'll give you a good example of this. Early on, when I was the director of Center Safe, I had one of the people I was supervising come in and talk to me, and she was just furious. She was really angry, and she talked to me about how supervisors shouldn't be, in our context, a supervisor shouldn't do this or this or this or this. They shouldn't have a private parking place. They shouldn't have special treatment. And as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, I don't do any of that. That is not at all. I don't have a special parking place. That's not how I supervise. And what I finally realized was that the woman that I was working with was reacting to supervisors she had had previously, and that there was in her mind, this is how all supervisors behave, right? So one of the places you can see that is if there's been a difficult pastoral relationship in a church and now you come in, interims I think get this all the time, and you come in, people may be reacting to you as they would have reacted to the pastor before you. That may have nothing whatsoever to do with who you are or what you're doing. They're reacting to the role and what they assume that role to be. That's kind of how transference works. Which means on the good side, we are neither as terrible as they think we are, but it also means we're not probably as wonderful as they may be thinking that we are. Praise for our leadership, our preaching, our teaching it's not that they want to, it's not a sexual come on. It's not that they really want to be friends with us. It may be rooted in something else. But because these dynamics happen, it makes congregants more vulnerable because our congregants are not usually aware that it's happening. If a parishioner is relating to you as their pastor, and the feelings they're feeling are not really about the pastor, but they're about feelings or lack of feelings they've had with another person of authority in their lives, with their father or a boss, perhaps. You're getting the impact of those feelings, but because they may not understand those, it makes them more vulnerable. So when we use a transference attachment for our own gratification, we're crossing that line. Now, it happens all the time. Transference is not a bad thing. It's kind of like that fire, it can be used for good or for bad, but it's something that we probably need to acknowledge and pay attention to. I'm going to ask, some of you have more experience at pastoral counseling than I do and may have had some experience with this. I'm going to see if anybody has anything they want to add to that. Okay, I'm not seeing hands up all right, let's talk a little bit about, and this has come up in some of our case studies, hugging and touch boundaries. COVID has changed a lot of things for us. And I know in many churches, the passing of the peace, which used to be hugging all over the place, is not that anymore. We're much more aware of the need for social distancing, if you will. So COVID has changed some things. And yet, touch still continues to be a part of a human experience. I'm very aware that often for people who are in nursing homes, no one other than someone working in a professional role, somebody who has come in to feed them or help them bathe, they haven't had loving, compassionate touch, sometimes for years, right? So touch is a critical part of who we are as human beings, and it can be an important part of pastoral care. But we also need to be really clear about several questions, I think. We need to be clear about whether our assumptions about touch and whether it will be helpful or not are really in that person's best interest. And we need to be creative, thinking, is there a better way to convey warmth and caring? I think as we've done the passing of the peace, what I have seen is, people in congregations sort of giving the peace sign or bumping elbows or waving or all of that. That's a way to connect that doesn't involve a full hug. So I think that there are ways to do that, but I think one of the things that's really critical is that when you don't know whether a hug or other kinds of touch will be how they'll be received, which quite frankly is most of the time, unless this is a close friend or family member, ask. It is important to ask. Several years ago, I got a phone call from the mother of one of the employees at CenterSafe, who I'd hired, and I knew, not the mother, I'd hired the employee, I knew her pretty well. Her father died, and her her mother did not wanted me to, her mother, who happened to be a pastor, by the way, wanted me to ask her to come into my office so that she could have that conversation with her daughter in a safe space. She didn't want to just call her up out of the blue because she didn't know what she might have been doing. And so I asked Ruth to come to my office, and then I put her on the phone with her mom, who told her that her father had died. My office was a safe space for her at that point, but as I was talking to Ruth, standing in the middle of my office, really, this was unexpected, didn't know what to do, was worried about her mother, was grief-stricken at the death of her father. Even though I knew her well, I also knew that Ruth was a sexual assault survivor. And so for me to just assume that what she wanted from me was a big old hug was not appropriate. But what I could do was say, would it be helpful to you if I gave you a hug? And that created a space for her to say, yes, it would, or nope, that's not what I need right now. And that's what we want to do when it comes to physical touch. We need to give people the space to say, yes, this is what I need, or no, that I don't need that right now. That would create more problems for me than it would solve, because that's true for some folks. And I think that we're not always used to asking. That feels awkward sometimes, but my experience has been pretty consistent that asking whether people are comfortable or what they need is a much better way to approach that. Now, I will say there are also ways to ask, right? If what you ask is, can I give you a hug? And you're in a position of authority, sometimes people feel obligated to say yes. If what you ask is based in their need, what would be helpful for you right now? That allows them to have the space to say this or that, yes or no. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I want to talk a little bit. I'm going to see if we can do the video again. That could be a challenge. So I'm going to flip us back a couple of slides. And where to go? There it is. Nope, that's the wrong one. Let me go back here. There we go. And see if I can get us. We're going to talk a little bit about intimacy. These trainings started out long ago as trainings about clergy crossing the lines in terms of sexual intimacy. And I'm just going to tell you that the easiest way to do that is, it is never appropriate for anybody in a position of spiritual leadership to be engaged in sexual intimacy with a parishioner. Never, under any circumstances, is that okay. So that's the caveat. But I think it's important for us to understand how that can happen and how those things can get confused and what the dynamics of that are. So we're gonna play this part of this video, and then we're gonna come back and talk about it. Fingers crossed, boys and girls, that we can get where we need to be here for this. We are going to
You may not be the best way to do that. That's probably not what you really need. Now, I'm not talking about situations at funerals or in great crises and tragic accidents. There are appropriate times when you can hold someone at times of great loss and pain. But I'm thinking of when someone comes to you for spiritual advice, particularly as, you pick up, there's a lot more need here than I can meet. And that's why self-awareness and reading the emotional cues becomes such an important part of our ministry.
there seem to be some assumptions and expectations that people have about physical contact with us. There seems to be, on the part of some congregants, assumptions of physical access. So being more touchy and with the woman minister and expecting her to reciprocate.
Yeah, and because I'm small and I'm Asian and I've been like patted on the head and patted on the shoulder and patted on the, you know where. And so I said, you wouldn't do this to another male, would you? And another tall guy. And they said, oh, well, then I become more assertive about this. And then they're shocked. They still like want to keep me in my place, small, nice Asian.
And puts us in a very difficult position if that's something that we're just not comfortable with. How do you set that limit with a congregant who sees themselves as being friendly and affectionate and so forth and so on?
Towards them, a student comes towards them with the California hug, ready for the California hug. Then they put their hands into the Buddhist gesture of respect and they do this. And the person is often a little taken aback, but then they quickly come from here to here and then bow. And there's actually a lovely intimacy in that, in making eye contact and bowing to each other from the heart.
This particular congregation where I'm a pastor now, hugs are rare. But listening, carrying acts, appropriate nurturing of people, that's a very important value, and we see it all the time.
Some people have reacted to the discussion about careful boundaries with a very sort of all or nothing. Well, I just won't ever touch anyone again. And they, literally physically move back or move away. And then everything will be fine. That's not going to help. For one thing, touch is such an important part of interacting between people that we need to be able to, when it's appropriate, reach out and touch in a pastoral role. But there's a limit to that touch and to situations in which that may or may not be appropriate, depending on the other person and what their experience has been and what their needs are and so forth.
Crossing the border from this area to this area can be very dangerous.
Fine line between the intimacy that we have as a pastor with a parishioner and our own need for personal intimacy. What we do in ministry is very personal. When you're with someone and they're dying and you're holding their hand and you're listening to them and you're praying with them, that's as intimate as it gets, and that's very holy, precious time. But the intimacy I need as a woman, the intimacy I need in my own spiritual life, I need to get from my partner, from a spiritual director or another pastor.
Spirituality, intimacy, and sexuality are all dealing with the real personal, deep part of who I am as a human being. And when we talk about spirituality, we're talking about an intimate connection with ourselves and God. And when we talk about sexuality, we're talking about an intimate connection with ourselves and another. And it seems to me that we can get mixed up there.
My Dharma sister is in her 80s now, Joko Beck, and she told me that in her 70s, young male students who are in their 20s would come to her and confess in the spiritual interview that they had fallen in love with her. And she said, obviously it wasn't me, because here I am, 70 years old. And what it is that people fall in love with what we call the Dharma, the truth underlying the universe. When they catch a glimpse of that in a person who studies that and works with that all the time, what they're really seeing is themselves, their spiritual potential.
People are unaccustomed to the kind of unconditional positive regard that professionals are supposed to be presenting for the individual. They're not accustomed to it, and so they're surprised by it, even though that's what they come to get. And then it gets confused with, I am special. This is a special relationship. And they want it in all domains of their life. And that includes the physical expression of love, which might translate into sex.
To be naked before another person is our greatest desire, to be totally seen, physically naked and stripped to the core, to have someone know us down to our very deepest, darkest, nastiest nooks and crannies and still say, I love you. So that's our desire in the intimate relationship. It's also our desire in the spiritual relationship to have someone, could be a psychiatrist, could be a therapist, it could be our spiritual teacher or guide, to see us to the very bottom of our being and say, well, here's a part you need to work on, but you know, you're really okay as you are.
Sex is an expression of mutual intimacy. And the professional role in and of itself is one way, it's only one way intimacy.
I think ideally we think of sex as an example of crossing of a boundary that very few people cross with one another. A physical expression of a more emotional or spiritual even intimacy or connection or commitment to the other person.
So the same with sexual energy. When sexual energy arises in a relationship, I think it's saying, oh, the boundaries are going down. Isn't that interesting? I feel safe with this person.
Sexual intimacy is an expression of not just love, but it's also an expression of openness and vulnerability, to mutual openness and vulnerability to one another. And that is not what's going on in the professional relationship.
It might be nice to think that all of us are so enticing and good looking that people are just coming out of the woodwork for us. But I don't really believe it's about us at all. It's about our role. It's about wanting to get close to power. It's about wanting to get close to this kind of God source that people feel comes from a clergy person.
Within the therapist-client relationship or pastor-congregant relationship, there is that quality of confidentiality and uniqueness, and what's in this room stays in this room. And sometimes that gets confused with secrecy. And there's something about secrecy that I think might engender sexual feelings as well, a heightened sense of excitement or arousal because it's a secret and special.
But he was hugging and kissing a parishioner, and he would say, this is a secret between us. You know, I really love you and you do a lot for me, but we have spouses and I'm the minister. We can't tell anybody. And sort of enticed her into that by saying, you're the only person in the church who really knows who I am. That's very seductive language to say to anybody, you know, I've let you know me completely.
As I was in a pastoral counseling relationship with a man who became very vulnerable and open to me, more than he had probably been with anyone else before. And I felt the sexual tension growing in the room. And I knew something was happening. I was uncomfortable with it. I was embarrassed about it. I didn't seek supervision because I felt so guilty and uncomfortable with it. And I broke my own rule. And I knew that I had contributed to it in some fashion and I didn't like it. By the fourth session, when he came in to see me, I said, there's something going on here that feels sexual to me. What do you know about this? And he said, oh, I'm so glad you mentioned it. I am confused. It does feel sexual to me and I don't want it to feel this way. I love my wife, but I want to be able to talk to you. And at that point, I could step back and say, well, I think this is about how intimate you have been able to be with me, how open you've been with me. And the only other place you've been that intimate is probably with your wife. So it sounds like we're confusing intimacies.
I think if it's so alive in the room that it becomes a part of your time together, that it needs to be addressed in some ways.
Certainly, we can't legislate who we're attracted to, but we can make choices about whether we act on that or not. Just because I'm married doesn't mean I may not be attracted sexually to someone, but it's a whole different story if I decide to act on that.
All forms of intimacy have the same potential power and the same potential problems, and sexual intimacy more so than any others. When you cross the boundary and you become sexually intimate with someone, you know them in a way that links you together differently than any other person, but it also means that they become different to you than anybody else, and they can't be your congregant anymore. If it's going to be a good relationship, then they have to stop being your congregant, or you can't have a true relationship with them.
Certainly, the expectations on the part of some congregants for friendships and more intimate relationships with their religious leaders can be substantial. So the pressure is coming, from them. Again, it's our job to be clear about the limits to those relationships in their interest as well as in our own interest.
A certain kind of social relationship and romantic and sexual relationship actually paradoxically minimizes the spiritual relationship.
One of my mottos is don't take anything personally. That has two branches. Don't take the student's love for you personally. It has nothing to do with you. You are just a transparent channel for this higher truth. But you can use the energy of that connection that the person has to the higher power through you in a skillful way. Now, one of the things you have to keep doing is taking yourself down off the pedestal, because the students will keep trying to put you up on the pedestal. Everyone hopes that there's somebody out there who's perfect. And if they can make themselves just like that, then their life will be okay.
All right, I'm going to get us back where we need to be. In terms of one of the quotes in the video was that we can describe spirituality as the intimate connection between ourselves and God, and sexual activity as the intimate connection between ourselves and another person. And that sometimes these intimacies become confused. But again, as you have heard me say throughout this training, there are not a lot of hard and fast rules. A lot of what we're talking about depends on context and use of your judgment. This is one area where that is not the case. Sexual contact with a congregant is always inappropriate. It's always bad boundary crossing. It is never okay, and it has the potential of doing significant harm. That is absolutely true. One of the ways, and I think it's important to talk about this because we used to kind of group this all together. And really there's a continuum of people who abuse their authority. There are the wanderers, right? The folks who are not paying attention to their own needs, the folks who get into a situation or develop relationships over time, and those become more intense and more intimate. But there's no intentionality there. Those folks are very different than people who are predators. Predators are very clear about what they're doing, are very clear that what they are doing is meeting their needs and no one else's. And it is important that we be clear about sort of the differences here. And the cutoff place, which I think this is an interesting graphic, is when you see the rules don't apply to me, right? When people start thinking that the rules don't apply to them, now that can happen in a couple of ways. For the wanderers, it may be our relationship is so special. Our relationship is so unique that the normal rules don't apply. That's a problem. Predators just don't think that the rules apply to them at all. I will give you an example of this. This was such a wake-up call for me. Back when I was doing campus ministry, there was a colleague who I liked very much. He didn't work in my organization. He worked for another organization on campus, and I liked him very much. We collaborated on programs. If you had asked me who was the person, who was the colleague that I had the most in common with, it would have been this guy. Well, as it turned out, he was a serial rapist, and every place he had gone before he came, he had sexually assaulted and abused his parishioners, and then came to work on a campus. Talk about open season. He had actually threatened former parishioners with bodily harm. And I had no idea. You can't tell by looking. And so what happened was that he actually ended up violating a university policy, and they found a history of his phone calls with parishioners that he had threatened before he came there, and he was finally removed from the ministry and certainly removed from campus. But part of what that indicated to me is not only can you not always tell by looking, frequently you can't tell by looking, and by even by as well as you know someone, because a predator works really hard to keep their behavior and their inclinations secret. They work very hard at that, and most of them are quite good at it. But that's also the other thing I learned is that that's one of the reasons why it's really important to have policies and procedures in place so that you know when stuff happens and when it hits the fan, you know what you can do about that. Prevention and healthy boundaries, being clear about healthy boundaries, can stop many wanderers. You know, if we are clear about what the boundaries are, if we are paying attention to the things we need to pay attention to, if we are being accountable to others, that can stop people from kind of wandering and stumbling into situations. That's not going to stop someone who is a predator. It's just not, because they don't care about healthy boundaries. That's not an issue, or they don't believe that applies to them. So that's why when prevention fails, intervention is necessary, and that's why we have policies and procedures. We need to know, you know, it's about clear expectations. We've talked about that. It's about being clear what our expectations for behavior are, being clear about what's going to happen when those expectations are not met or are violated, and what our responsibility is in maintaining those. So I know sometimes we start talking about policies and people's eyes glaze over and roll back in their head like, oh, please don't make me have another policy. These are the things, these are the constructs that we put in place to help keep our congregations safe, to help keep us safe. And they're really critical. All right, I'm going to stop and see if people have questions about any of that. Then we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and finish up. But let me see, do people have questions, comments, thoughts, reactions about this section? I'm not seeing hands raised, and I'm not hearing anybody jump in. Okay, that may just mean that you really need a break, which is okay. Let's take a break. Let's come back at 12:15. If you need to grab something to eat, please do that. We'll come back at 12:15 and we will finish up, and I promise you we will be done by 1. Okay? All right. I'm gonna see if I can stop recording because we don't need to record our break. Let's do that first. Stop sharing. Oh, I turned it off. Okay, friends, I think we're gonna keep rolling here as my husband says, the sooner we get started, the sooner we'll get it over with. So let's keep going. One of the things that I was asked to do was to see if we could talk a little bit about social media and finances. And so we're going to do that a little bit. I am by no means, as you have surely been able to tell, an expert in technology or social media, nor am I an expert in finances, but I do know some stuff. But I want us to talk a little bit. Social media and technology generally has really changed the way that that all of us interact and communicate, the ways that we communicate with people we love and care about in our families, our friends, but also the ways that we do things in the church. And I think it's important, again, a lot of this is about intentionality. It is important for us to be clear about what we are doing and the intentionality of our work. It used to be you had very clear lines between the internet, which is where we did work, and social media, which is where we sort of played and connected with friends and found people that we went to elementary school with that we hadn't talked to in a long time. And texting, which we may have done with our children or our close friends. The reality is those are now blurring. All of the lines in those are all very blurry. We use all of those things for work. We use all of those things in our personal lives. And part of what we have to do is be really thoughtful about that. And think about what are the implications of that. And I think for most of us in our churches, although there may still be some fear of using social media or technology, instead of asking the question about, is social media right for us, or should we put our services online? What if we asked ourselves as congregations a question that is framed like, how do I and my community, how do we practice our faith tradition in ethical and meaningful ways in the digital world? How do I attend to boundary issues that are particular to this kind of digital world in which we live? Those, I think, are the questions we need to ask. So part of what I'd like for you all to do, and we'll just do this as brainstorming and thinking it through, what are the benefits of living in the digital world and doing ministry and being the church in the digital world? What have you all found to be benefits of that?
Just the fact that today's session is online is a benefit.
Exactly. Exactly. Which could be a good thing or not necessarily a good thing, but yes,
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Folks are able to work from home, which enabled them to better manage work and workload and life. The stigma of, well, we can't do that because we've never done it that way has gone out the door, because now during COVID, everything changed and how we did things changed. I get to see my grandchildren, and when during COVID and there were football games with no spectators, I could see them online and watch the football game. Next Saturday, I'm going to an educational seminar at Juniata College on AI and the church, artificial intelligence and the church. And what does that mean? And what kind of problems and possibilities can that represent? I don't know anything about AI. So I thought, I don't know anything about it, so I guess I should go. So I'm going. So I think there's a lot of pros and cons. It opens up a lot of negativity and shaming of our girls, and girls can be nasty in high school and just bullying people. And so there's pros and cons. So as an adult, I wholly appreciate it. As a child, I think there needs to be limits and parental controls, and I think our parents need to be well educated.
Yeah, agreed. And I don't know that we as the church have done that very well, educated the parents. And that those may be conversations where we as the church need to be actively involved, right? In terms of how do we keep our kiddos safe in a digital world? Have others of you had experience in the digital world online or with online worship or with social media that you're comfortable sharing? Pros or cons?
We're online, we're on Zoom, and our congregants have come back. That was a concern, but everybody's come back, but we've been able to reach those that are in nursing homes and those that are homebound. And my sister in South Dakota joins my service. So that's all kind of nice.
I had that same
opened up the world.
experience.
It
Yeah,
opened up the world.
It did. It does open up the world. I had that same experience again last week when I was preaching, and my daughter in Kentucky could listen to me preach. Which and what I have frequently said is technology is a wonderful thing until it's not. And so if it's, when the audio is not working or the visual's not working, it's not always great. How about some other folks? What have you found are the benefits of being in your specific to your congregational life to being part of the digital world?
Well, one thing, I'm not on a lot of stuff, but I am on Facebook. Being able to post sermons or just little encouragements. But one rule that I have is that I will, if some church member sends me a friend request, I will friend them, but I don't send friend requests out because I don't want anyone to feel obligated to friend me because I'm the pastor. So that's one way I deal with that.
And hold on to that thought, Lori, because we're going to talk a little bit more about that and are there some concrete things that we can put in place to sort of manage that?
I don't friend anybody, and I tell them I'm not going to friend them because then you see what they're into and what they're not into. And if you like it, but then sometimes you don't like it, what does that mean? And so I tell them I am not friending anybody. If you need to get in touch with me, I'm on Messenger. You can message me, you can call me, you can text me. There are other ways that you can reach me. But and you can tell me what you want about your life, but I'm not going to invade your life through Facebook.
Right. And here I think as you're seeing the slide about there are some potential benefits. There are some benefits to being part of the digital world, but there are also some risks, right? There can be miscommunication. Again, it's much more difficult it's much easier to misunderstand, let's put it that way, when you're not in person. It can create unrealistic expectations of access to you. If you're because when you are on Facebook, you can see the other people, if you choose to look, who are on Facebook at the same time. Does that mean that they have access to you to ask you questions or do church business? It can complicate dual relationships. There are folks for whom online time has become addictive. It can be unhealthy. People can spend way too much time online, not only in terms of just screen time, which we know is problematic for kiddos, but also adults can get sucked in. I don't know how many of you have had the experience of what they call doom scrolling. You start scrolling and you just keep going and you think, what am I doing here? I need to go to bed, or I have work to do, or a sermon to write. And it's very addictive. You get sucked in. I think it actually triggers some things in your brain that make it hard to put it down and say no. So I think that's one of the things we have to pay attention to as well. As teachers and clergy, I think we bring resources to our role, our knowledge, our experience, our training, where we are, and I know all of you who serve churches have experienced this, of being both a public figure as the same time as you're trying to maintain a personal, private life, right? So, and social media and being online just makes all of that much more difficult because our professional lives and our personal lives overlap to a certain extent anyway. And that the digital space makes it even harder to maintain and balance that. So I think these are the questions we want to ask ourselves. When we're online, are we maintaining the integrity of the clergy congregant relationship? Are we recognizing the reality of power and vulnerability present? Because social media can erase those boundaries, right? And we have to really be intentional about maintaining them. Are we making choices that sustain healthy practices? How many of you have had the experience of either saying, because this happens, or recognizing that people's filters seem to disintegrate a bit when they're in online communication? You know, if you get an email that, because you can't understand the tone, that seems like it's overly critical, sometimes your response is to dash an email right back to that person, right? So sometimes our barriers and our filters that actually act as brakes on when they need to be on our behalf or on behalf of others aren't working so well. People are much more likely to say things online than they would never dream of saying were they face to face or in person. But somehow being online is enough of a distance maker that people will say things. And so keeping these questions in the forefront about maintaining the integrity of the relationship, recognizing the power and vulnerability, and making choices that sustain healthy boundaries, that's really critical. Lori, I thought you had something to jump in.
I guess one way I deal with that is that I mean, I don't have any, any family living really, except for a few cousins, but so my Facebook is 98% church. So I never post anything or like anything that I would be embarrassed for someone from church to see, just because it's all professional, 98% professional related. But I have seen other clergy or friends, not in this presbytery, but some of the things they post on their Facebook pages, and I just wonder that, gosh,
Yeah, it's kind of surprising at times, some of the things that you see. And I think there are some built-in boundaries that we can manage, right? So that you could hypothetically have a personal account and a professional account. That's very possible if you wanted to do that. Now you got to pay attention to that because it's easy to get them confused. I think the choices that you all talked about, some of us choose to friend or follow people in the congregations, others not. When I was working at CenterSafe, I never accepted a friend request, nor did I make a friend request to people that I had to supervise. So any of the employees, I just didn't do that. Partly because that seemed to break a barrier that really needed to be there. And I use barrier in a positive way. But it gives people access into your personal life. I think as long as those decisions are conscious decisions that we're making, I think you can have a rationale for making either one, but I think sometimes for me it was just easier. I'm just not going to be friends with people that I'm working with. That was just easier to do. You can set your privacy settings. I am still, though these many years, I am getting reminders from my children about the information that I have had on social media. My daughter texted me not long ago. I had posted something and she said, "Mom, you need to take your phone number off." I know. It was my signature on my email, right? And on my signature on my email, I had my personal address. Because when I had a signature on my work email, I always had my work address. So when I was doing my signature on my personal email, I put my home address. And my daughter says, "Mom, you need to have your home address in your signature line that everybody can see." Okay, all right, had to think about that. So what are the privacy settings and what's the information that we want to share and not share? When it comes to working with the social media for our churches, various people can be the administrators. if you're a solo pastor, chances are you're the administrator, or at least one of them, on your church's Facebook page. And that's a good thing. I think you should, and if you're not, you probably should be. I was an admin on all of our social media, not because I wanted to do it, but because I wanted to be able to see it as it was rolling out. And then if there was a problem, I was in a position to address it. So I think that there are those kinds of ways you can do that. There are some ways we can manage our organizational use and our individual use, right? We have to pay attention to what we post online as an individual. But also as a pastor, the reality is our personal and professional lives overlap. I wish there was a clear and concrete line between them. There is not. You'll see in this Venn diagram, there's some overlap. I would say it's probably bigger than that little tiny slice that you see on the screen. There are some things to remember. Everything you put online is online forever. It's out there forever. You may try to take it back, and sometimes the social media sites tell you you can edit it, or you can delete it, or you can let it not go. But the reality is, once it's out there, it's out there. The lines, again, between your professional and your personal lives they may be very clear to you. It is unlikely that they are that clear to people in your congregation. You may have a very clear idea of what the boundaries are, but unless you talk about that with some regularity with your congregation, chances are they are not as clear about that as you are. And so it's important to have those conversations and to pay attention to the fact that they may not realize that that you are trying to keep your personal life and your professional life separate. I wish we could draw those hard and fast distinctions, but unfortunately we cannot. When you are using, here are some guidelines I think to think about. When you're using social media in your ministry, think about this. How many of you have a policy in your congregations on the use of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Zoom? Who has a policy? Anybody? Raise your hand. Probably not many of you, right? Partly that's because when we say we need a policy for that, again, people's eyes glaze over and they roll back in their head. Nobody wants to write a policy. It's horrible. It's hard. The reality is there are some good examples of some social media policies, but it's important to have one, particularly if you are trying to integrate social media into the life and work of your church. You need to have a policy on that. You need to have a policy that includes things about transparency. Who's allowed to post and who's not? What are the guidelines? What kinds of things are acceptable and unacceptable? If somebody's selling Girl Scout cookies, can they put that on the church Facebook page? That may be something that you want to say yes or no to. You need to think about that. You need to have someone in the organization supervising or monitoring the content. That could be you. That could be someone who's designated to do that. And again, I like it. Laura, I think Gloria is the one who said that you don't friend or follow people, but you do respond to requests as appropriate. One of the things that I think it's important to think about too, and we talked about texting earlier in the conversation, because the nuance of interpersonal communication is much harder to do over text, it's important to pay attention. We never, ever did any kind of counseling or provided service online. One, because it's not a confidential form of communication, but also because it's so difficult to understand what's being said. Now, I will say eventually we moved into having a text line where we could do that with the appropriate caveats, but we did that because people under 30 don't talk on the phone. You may have noticed that. They don't talk on the phone. They text, they communicate in other ways. And so it's important to be clear about that, but also then be clear about what are the limits of that. Are you going to engage in a text conversation that turns into a pastoral counseling session? How do you offer good pastoral care via text? That's a tough call. So those are the kinds of things we have to think about. The things that can be in your policy and guidelines can be things as simple as we don't post photos of people without their permission, right? I will tell you, I was the mother who frustrated the school district and at times the church by saying, nope, you can't put pictures of my kids online. Can't do it. I do not give my permission for that. Some people are okay with that. I was not. I think generally it's a wise idea not to post pictures of children online because that's how predators identify them. So I wouldn't, but think about what you're liking. Think about what you're retweeting. For some of us on Facebook especially, a like may just mean I read it. But for some people, if they see that you liked something, that may mean for them that you agree with it. And so you have to be, again, cognizant of that. All of this is the kind of stuff that can be in a policy. And again, I'll give you some examples of some policies. And the trade-offs is if we want younger people to be engaged in the work of the church, we have to change the way we do things. But we also have to do that with compassion and care and caution, right? So here are some examples of some social media policies. I will send, or Susan we'll send a copy of this. It's being recorded, but we'll also send a copy of the slide deck. It's not proprietary to me. I'll send it out for you all. So you should be able to access these links. Most of it's online. I will tell you, I wasn't overly impressed with what the Presbyterian Church did, partly because it was focused on General Assembly and use of cell phones in General Assembly. But the Lutherans and the UCCs and the Methodists have tended to be a little bit more ahead of the curve on some of this. So some of these policies are probably quite good. And I would use them as an example in your churches. For your policy, policies do not have to start from ground zero, right? Use what's out there and you'll probably end up with a good product. I want to talk a little bit about finances. When you get into trouble with finances, and again, these are some things that I sort of assumed that everyone knew, but in fact they don't. Sometimes it's carelessness, sometimes it's misuse of funds, sometimes it's very intentional embezzlement. We know the problems that this creates in churches. You all have probably had those kinds of situations where it's a betrayal of trust on the part of the congregation. There are some liability and criminal issues that have to be paid attention to. People stop giving. And again, part of the way that we handle this is to be very clear about what our policy is and our rules are. I will also tell you one of the things that is that sexual boundary violations often correlate with financial boundary violations. They often go hand in hand. Partly because people are, once you get in the habit of keeping secrets, it becomes easier to keep lots of secrets. And it doesn't become easier logistically, it becomes easier to justify keeping secrets to yourself, right? So here are some of the rationalizations that people use when they are engaging in behavior that's problematic around the finances. I'm just borrowing it and I'll pay it back. I know for a fact that has happened in some of our churches and our presbytery before, where people in positions of authority, and I believe that every intention was to pay it back. But the problem was it wasn't theirs to start with, right? And as we all know, the road to hell is paved with all those good intentions to pay it back. They'll never know the difference. The church has enough money, they're never going to miss it. That is probably one, not true for most churches. And two, it's definitely not true for churches who are paying attention to how their finances are every year or all the time. It's been years since I had a raise. Isn't that easy to sort of justify? You know, I'm making barely the minimum, and I'm giving my whole life to this church, and they owe me. They owe this to me. So I'll just tell myself. Yeah, or I need it more than some of these people need it. The rationalizations for financial impropriety, and you can see that some of this is does not have the evil intention of theft or embezzlement, but it may result in that. It may result in that. So how do we ensure clear boundaries in the management of our finances? We have transparency. The people who need to know your sessions ought to know everything about your finances. And I will tell you that sometimes it's really difficult because not every finances can be difficult and complex. And it's hard to read a balance sheet without your eyes glazing over. But part of your responsibility as the moderator of a session is to make sure that the people on your session know what they're looking at, right? Are they understanding what the expenses are and what the cost of doing ministry are? That transparency is really critical. And accountability. Who's in charge? Do you have an audit committee? Does your treasurer give reports at every session meeting? That should be happening. So that it is accountability built in. And is there a separation of personal and faith committee finances? So hopefully there is, although your church may have a credit card that you have access to or that you use, but you should never use those for your own personal expenses, even if you think you're going to pay it back. You know, oh, I happen to be in Staples and I'm picking up stuff for the church, but I also need some stuff at home. I'll just do it all here. The easiest way to manage that is not to do it in the first place. If you do, you better keep that receipt and you better go through it with your church treasurer so that they know what you're doing and you can give a full accounting. Discretionary funds should not be used for personal needs or as a slush fund for personal banking or for routine budget items. I will also say, and I don't know how many of you in your churches have a pastor's discretionary fund. Some churches do, some do not. For those churches that do, again, the guidelines and the expectations for its use need to be very clearly laid out, right? I would have it in writing and share it with the session. And you can have things on it like what's the dollar limit? What is the discretionary fund? Now, you know, the reality is people come to pastors for help and it's not always possible to call a session meeting. So that's why some folks have set up those discretionary funds. But there needs to be clear expectation for how those are used, what's an appropriate use of those, and what the dollar limit is. And you can ask your session if you need to set aside those guidelines, but then you've involved more people in those conversations, which is what you want to do. The bank statement should be sent to someone other than the person who is writing the checks. So now, again, you probably have a treasurer who writes the checks and manages the accounts. Maybe you need that person to get the bank statement, but can it go to somebody else? Can you put two people on it so that you don't just have one person who is managing all of the money? This last thing about the faith leader should tell the session if you receive gifts of significant value. People are going to give you presents, and that's okay. But again, what's the upper limit, right? If you have a congregation member who says, we have a house on the Outer Banks and we would like to give it to you for a week to use at your discretion whenever you want because we really appreciated your pastoral leadership. Would you go and have that conversation and let your session know that that's a gift that you've been offered? That's a pretty significant gift. We're talking thousands of dollars maybe. How do you handle that? Is to have that conversation with your session. And there's, if you have a dollar amount limit in your head to say, if somebody walks into your office with a Starbucks, although those are pricey, but if they walk into your office and they have a coffee from Starbucks, you probably don't need to report that to session. If somebody walks in and says, we want you to use our house on the beach for a week, that may need to be a conversation. So, kind of have that dollar amount in your head. Or have a policy have that be part of your financial policies, if that's something that makes sense to you. Business expenses, reimbursable items need to be reported in a timely way, need to include receipts. You should have an annual outside audit or review, which is your standard procedure. And I think most of our churches do this. 2 unrelated people should count the monies from the collection every Sunday. Most of the churches I've been in, that's their practice. But part of what you want to do is have what they call in the nonprofit world internal controls, right? You want to just double check to make sure that the funding is being managed not just by one person. And that one person absolutely should not be you. It can be, you can be one of a group or one of 2 to manage that. Oh, just a few more. Cash and checks need to be safeguarded. You know this. Keys to the buildings, business office, clergy offices should be accounted for. One of the things that often happens is keys sort of multiply. So-and-so needs a key to get into the building because they need to start the coffee before worship, and they've just, keys sort of, they're like rabbits. They just kind of multiply at times. And part of what we need to do is have a really clear idea of who's got a key and why do they have it. And if they need it for a specific task, are they returning it somewhere so that we don't have keys out all over the place? That helps us that's good stewardship, right? It's good stewardship to keep track of the resources. And while it's always easy to sort of say, we're going to make an exception just this once, please be careful making exceptions to these guidelines. All right, the final category that we were going to talk about, and I promised you we'd be out by 1, and we will, is about self-care. One of the things we've talked about all the way through this morning is that part of the way we pay attention to boundaries is by also paying attention to our own needs and making sure that we are taking care of those. There are some challenges to self-care. But it's important because if our needs aren't being met in appropriate ways, our tendency will be to find ways to meet them in ways that are inappropriate. So there are some scriptural mandates for that, and we want to make sure that we are paying attention to self-care. In these last few minutes, what I would like for you please to do is take 2 minutes, write down 3 things that you are currently doing for your own self-care. That could be anything from exercise to diet to spiritual disciplines. But write down 3 things. You don't need to share those unless you want to. 3 things that you are currently doing for your own self-care. It shouldn't take you but a minute. It shouldn't take very long. Okay. There are some barriers. There are some things that get in our way for self-care, particularly in the context of a congregation. One of those things is that we begin to believe that we're invincible, that we don't actually need self-care, that we can do it. I grew up in a home and with a grandmother for whom being stoic was really, really important. And, the messages I got as a kid was, you just need to suck it up and move forward. I think a lot of us grew up with messages that say, just suck it up and move forward. That leads to a sense that we are invincible and that we don't need our own self-care. Another barrier, I think, is a sense of indispensability, that people cannot do without me, that I can't go on vacation, that I can't take study leave, because the congregation will fall apart if I do. If that is a feeling that you carry around, there are a couple of things to pay attention to. One is, what's that saying about the health of your congregation? And two, what need is that sense of I'm indispensable filling for you, right? Another barrier is that lack of a margin between load and limit, that we just don't know what our limits are. And so we go and go and go until we hit burnout. Some ways to think about this: have a life that does not involve your congregation. We should, all of us, have things outside of the church that we do. Maybe it's an exercise class. Maybe it's we have a friend who is not a member of the congregation and we go to the movies with them every other week. Having a life outside of the congregation, whether it's your kids or family or friends, is really critical. But it's also important to have colleagues internal to the presbytery that you can go to for study and support. Nobody else knows what a pastor's life is like more than another pastor. So find colleagues that you can go to for support and care, because they're the ones who get it, right? Remember who you are and what you represent. I don't know that I need to even tell you that. Discover the joy of boundaries. These are some lovely quotes that people have shared with the training. But the ones I like: don't take yourself so seriously, but also take yourself very seriously, right? That seems to make no sense on the surface of it. But what it means is that, one, it's not always about you, and yet what you do is important. And so trying to find the appropriate balance between those two, I think, is critical in terms of self-care. And you can't lose if you are paying attention to Luke's encouragement to pray always and do not lose heart. I want to let you know that we are about 8 minutes of one, that there are one of the things, again, that I found as I was pulling this together, not only are the videos available online, but, and I'm going to show you this link if I can do it, the whole training, including the workbooks. There's a Healthy Boundaries, Boundary Basics 101, Healthy Boundaries 201, has some really excellent self-assessments in them that I would encourage you to use. One of the things that the Faith Trust Institute has done is that they have made these things available online. What you should be seeing here is a website called VAWNet. That's Violence Against Women Net. It is managed by the National Resource Center for Domestic Violence, which actually is housed in Pennsylvania. And the Faith Trust Institute has made all of this available online for free to download. I asked Jenny beforehand, and we may do this in trainings going forward if it makes sense, because if you scroll down here, you can see the whole video series. You can also then get the workbooks in English or Spanish, both for the 101 and the 201, and you can download them. Now, you know, they're in PDF, so they're not easily accessible to write in, but you can have them. And I really, really encourage you to look at those, because the self-assessments in them are actually quite good. And I think you will find them beneficial. There's also a lot of other good stuff in there that you can look at when you want to. All right, I'm going to stop. Well, I'll show you the next slide, which is thoughts, questions, comments, and reflections. But I'm going to go back to stop sharing my screen so that we can see, are there questions, comments, thoughts, reflections, anything that you have been burning to say since we started? Now is your time. We have a few minutes before 1, so I would love to hear your thoughts.
My thought is about the social media. I don't participate in any of that. And what bothers me about our people in our congregation is, if they want to get a hold of me, they text me, which I don't keep my phone on my hip like a lot of people do. So I don't see the text maybe for days. And I keep wondering, give me a phone call. I have a phone number. I have 2 phone numbers. I'm available. Give me a call. And people don't do that anymore. It's like you said, the younger people don't. Well, the older people don't either. They often just wonder why they're not hearing from me. And hey, call me.
Yeah, we now live in a world where the expectation for an immediate response is pretty widespread. And so I think when we are not in a position to do that, I have been learning how to turn my phone off or put it away for periods of time. And I think that creates problems. There is an irony to it, though. If you have children who are adults who text you and you don't respond, and then they start to worry about where are you and why aren't you responding, that's a little bit of turnabout is fair play. I'm just saying. You used to worry about them, but I mean, there is an expectation of immediate response, and I think that's one of those places we all of us have to just navigate and negotiate. Other thoughts? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, concerning about text and social media. So I do encourage the leaders that are here right now, and we spread the word to, have a policy that's based on social media and tech use in the church. It'll be really helpful, and it'll be really, really nice to have, especially for new leaders that are coming up, because of our day of age. It is changing, like what Tricia says. Everyone's texting. It's not just for little kids, and young ones. Even my older congregation members, they're doing it now because they are lack of hearing, and they find out that texting through speech is a lot easier and accessible to them. And also when it comes to playing games as well, it's social media and games now aren't necessarily for our youth. I have a lot of congregation members, especially people who do consider themselves shut in, having ways of utilizing cell phone games as a way of connecting to other church members. Little things like Scrabble, Words with Game. You might want to also put in a policy about, on cell phone games and the use of your finances, because especially for some of these older people, they're thinking to themselves, oh, it's only $19, and it just keeps going on and on and on. You're like, okay. And then suddenly they start to have issues with as they get older with their health, and they are going to need some funds and things. So a lot of this is going to be the educational part for us leaders when it comes to living in this now digital age, whether we like it or not. It's, again, this isn't an age for younger people. I have a congregation that the average age is 65, and they all now have cell phones. They all have an Amazon account. They're all playing games where I have to remind people in our congregation, you cannot play your Words with Friends game during worship or meetings or anything. So please put it down, and I don't want to hear it ringing. But yeah, they contact me even right now. I'm getting text messages through our shut-in folks because they can't hear me on the phone very well, but they can do speech to text, and I'm trying to still decipher it. But it is accessible. But bringing up policies and educating our congregation members, because this also opens the door to fraud and scams a lot.
Yeah.
And I had just had a person come in our church to talk about all the scams and frauds and how to avoid them, and again, how they are going through messages. And we are actually having a person come in to talk about, I have a friend that's going to be joining us through one of our session meetings, talking about the use of AI and how now AI is being used to scam people with our voices, recognizable voices. It is out there now. So there's a lot of things in technology that are great, but also there's a lot of things that we have to be careful about, and it's going to impact our congregation, especially our older ones. So keep that in mind.
Ryan, I think that is so helpful, and I'm really wondering if this is something that we could talk with COPL about doing some training for the for the presbytery widely about some of those issues. Cause I think, you know, I do this training. I'm almost 68, you know, I just barely know what AI is, and I certainly have no idea of the impact it can have on our congregations. But I think your point is really critical. Most of us are working with aging congregations, and we need to be paying attention to the ways that the technology can benefit and help them stay connected, but also can be used in ways that are really negative. I'm sorry, Scott, I cut you off. Go right ahead.
No, that's all right. I just wanted to thank you, Ann, for an excellent workshop. It was terrific. And we need this kind of education. I also am feeling at the end of it that we have to be creative in finding ways to be warm and personal and friendly and not cross boundaries at the same time. And that, you know, preaching the word is not a mechanical thing, it's a personal relationship. Jesus wanted to establish personal relationships, and it's hard to do that if you're cold. You have to find a way to exude warmth and passion and without crossing boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add that I will take that concern about the digital era to COPL. I was just kidding with our clerk of session that we need to have a scam mission. And I think it's true. We've had a lot of and it gets more and more vicious in a way. So I think that's important. And also all the research recently that's come up about the irreparable damage of too much cell phone usage to youth between the ages of 8 and 14. And that's becoming validated by research. And they unfortunately don't feel the people who have been too much affected can be reversed. So I think we can take a big role in that. And I think that might be something to bring up at COPL. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Hila. Other comments or thoughts as we're winding down?
Thank you. I thought that last comment was beautiful. It's a wonderful way to end, and I hated to bring something else
Yes,
in.
I agree. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Scott. You all have been incredibly patient and are probably really needing to get up and walk around, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. Thank you. This is work that is important to me and has been for years and years, which is why I continue to do it. But your feedback, I thought about this yesterday, and I need to probably figure out a way to get feedback forms, and partly because this is a mandated training for everybody in the presbytery, it should be fairly easy to get feedback on it. So we will take the list of you, and you should expect probably, you know, in the next week or two, just a really brief feedback form, and it would be helpful to me and helpful to COM and helpful to COPL and to Jenny and to Kate and all the people who are in charge of that, if you would give us your feedback. So we will put that together and send it to you via email. I'm gonna leave you with this, and I'm just gonna, hello. I'm gonna read it to you from, oh, well, there it went. All right, let's try it again. All right. Just our closing thought from Colossians 3:12-17. Therefore, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. And above all else, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Will you pray with me as we close? Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for the insight and the wisdom of all of us, that we can come together and share from our own experiences, that we can be open to learning new things, and that we truly are one body. Be with us as we end this time today together. Keep your joy in our hearts, that we may walk in your word and in your grace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all
Thank
very
you.
much. And I hope the
Thank
rest of
you.
the weekend is as pretty as it is right this minute.